the real problems in Britain is that we just had these chancellors and these ne'er-do-wells in charge for a few years called the Conservative Party. And if we get them out of the way, the Rolls-Royce machine of the British state and the British economy will roar into gear again, just as it did in the 1990s. This is their story. And of course, that isn't the case at all. Like, you can't put at the top of a machine that doesn't work a different driver and expect the machine to work. Like, machine isn't working. The state isn't working. And the economy isn't working. So if you go, hey, we've just got this sort of rather dull lawyer to run it rather than whoever you want to pick from the Conservative Party, you don't get fundamentally different results. You get the same results.
In the 2024 general election, the Green Party of England and Wales had their best ever result. They quadrupled their Westminster representation from 1 to 4 MPs. Now, that might not sound particularly impressive, but bear in mind, they had no MPs before 2010. But it's in the last 6 months in particular, under the leadership of Zack Polanski, that the party has really gone from strength to strength. They've regularly featured in the top 3 when it comes to national polls, even sometimes coming second, even on one occasion coming first. They've surpassed 220,000 members, and they even won a by-election in Gorton and Denton at the end of February. This feels like the national arrival of the Green Party as an organisation able to compete not just with nearly Rands and also Rands, but the Tories and the Labour Party too. Dare I say, some are even talking about them replacing the Labour Party in parts of the country as the party of the centre-left. But alongside their rise, of course, is the rise of reform as well. It's a mixed story for those on the left, centre-left and progressives generally. But who are the Greens? We know who Zack Polanski is. He's clearly a very good media operator. He's very talkative. He's very affable. But what would they actually do in government? What drives them? What's their theory of change? What's their strategy to change the country? Those are exactly the kinds of questions I wanted to put to James Meadway. He has recently started a new think tank, which is Green Aligned. They're doing some really great work. Their name is Verdant. And he was formerly the chief economist at the New Economics Foundation and worked later on for John McDonnell. In short, he's been involved in progressive political circles for the best part of 20 years, and he's now decided the Greens are the party for him. He's standing in Tower Hamlets as a council candidate in May. This is a conversation which maybe surprises you. I'm talking about the Green Party and how they will govern with somebody who's not even a Green MP. But James, as you're about to find out, has a very big brain and has thought about all of these questions for a very long time. James Meadway, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks for having me.
It's long overdue. I remember talking to you when you were just starting out as an advisor to John McDonnell when he was the Shadow Chancellor. I came to see you in the House of Commons. It was in the first couple of weeks of Corbyn winning the leadership in 2015. A lot's changed.
Yeah, an awful lot. We're no longer in those. They were terrible offices. It was like they were taking the piss really with these kind of crumbling Victorian pile. You say to people, "Oh, you're in the House of Commons, you're in Parliament. You know, it's leader of the opposition office." It sounds very grand, and actually, you get to this sort of vermin-infested Victorian pile with everything crumbling away. And of course, you might remember the story that the predecessors of Jeremy Corbyn and John had ripped out all of the computers and the office equipment, so you were just left with these bare offices with nothing in them for the first sort of week or so of John and Jeremy starting. So yes, a lot's changed since then, at least.
In terms of the Labour Party establishment machine trying to ruin that from the get-go, I mean, it's so much worse than people think. Yeah. I remember somebody working on the social team, I think for John or Jeremy, and they were having to pay for, the Premiere Pro software themselves because they couldn't get sign-off for the funding from the party. There was just a wrecking operation from day one. We've talked about that at length at Novara Media. We broke even some stories relating to it, but I think that's always important to remember. We've got you on today for a bunch of reasons. We've got the local elections and, of course, elections to the Senedd and Holyrood, some mayoral races as well in May. You are now a member of the Green Party.
Yes.
You're standing as a candidate in Tower Hamlets.
Yes.
You have just started Verdant.
Yes.
Which is a Green Party aligned think tank.
Yes, independent but aligned. So we'll talk to all sorts of people from all sorts of political parties.
So that's going to be part of the conversation.
Yes.
The Greens and what is going to happen both before and following those mayor elections. What are the long-term prospects and possibilities of the Green Party. I also just want to talk to you about the sort of crisis and challenges of British politics in 2026, because you're a great person to talk about all that stuff. And then the final bit is really, where do we go for the rest of the 2020s, 2030s? And that's really relevant to the Green Party bit, because right now it seems that the Green Party will be an increasingly important actor in political life in this country. I suppose I want to start the conversation within the context of very recent developments. We've had this Iran war. Seemingly a ceasefire has been negotiated. When this is broadcast, we don't know how that will look. But in any case, it's certainly not going to be conclusively decided for a while yet. Has Keir Starmer's handling of this conflict surprised you? You know, some might say he stood up to Trump a little bit, at least rhetorically. He certainly offered something of a different approach compared to the Tories or Reform would have. Has that, has that helped him? Has that to some extent undermined the sort of political messaging of somebody like a Zack Polanski, that this person is a warmonger, that they're totally aligned with Donald Trump? Because that doesn't really seem the case anymore.
Well, look, he's done a very Keir Starmer thing of going backwards and forwards, right? He sort of said one thing and double backing it somewhat later. Look, the key to understanding Keir Starmer in this one is his initial positioning, and still maintained, is the Gorton and Denton by-election, right? The Iran war started, the day after that, wasn't it? If it had been the day before, you'd have a very different Keir Starmer. You'd have a Keir Starmer who'd be supporting Donald Trump. But as soon as you had that election result, as soon as it was abundantly clear that Labour was facing something approaching existential political threat over not only the war in relationship to Donald Trump, but this is a major part of Keir Starmer's problem. They completely shifted on this, and that was domestic politics driving that realignment. Now, there are bigger questions that start to float into this. Like Keir Starmer started talking about the need for a realignment with the EU and talking up positively the benefits of this, and that's a broader, really big sort of state strategy question for the British state in general, that it starts to open up if you distance yourself somewhat from Donald Trump. But I think the main thing to understand about what Keir Starmer's been doing is understanding the domestic politics of it. And his response to it, part of that was, that's why you have to stand up to Donald Trump.
So I'm just going to repeat what you said. I'm going to condense it a little bit, because it's not a complicated thing you've just said, but I've not actually heard it explicitly stated in that way. The Gorton by-election is a decisive factor in Starmer pulling away from the special relationship. That's what you're saying?
Yes. This is a response to domestic politics. The Labour Party is sitting there wildly exposed in all sorts of different fronts. And I know that they all want to do a big pretense. And Starmer himself, right from the get-go, has been, I am a great world statesman. And he's clearly happier when he's not here, when he's somewhere else, glad-handing whoever it might be. To greater or lesser effect, we can talk about that. But you have this pretense and you have the reality, and the hard reality is that you cannot start losing seats like Gorton and Denton if you're a Labour Party, and it just doesn't have an impact. And the immediate impact is, what does the response of a Labour government look like to an international crisis? Had that election happened later, after the Iran war had started, then I think we'd been looking at a different response when the Iran war started from Keir Starmer. I don't think you'd have had that domestic political pressure. But that's now serious and real for him and for Labour.
So that's the internal sort of political context. Do you think alongside that, parallel to that, you've got Mark Carney in Canada, you've got Sanchez in Spain, you've got centre-left political leaders who are plotting a very different course, and actually it's very popular with their domestic electorates, and it's winning them a ton of praise on the international stage, and they have a distinctive political brand, which, let's be quite frank, Keir Starmer does not have. Do you think that complements the domestic element you're talking about?
Well, it fits alongside. You're still really in domestic politics land there. This is the raw electoral calculation part of it. The bigger picture is the British state's orientation, really since the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. That is, we do not have an independent position in the world, except on rare occasions. Think about Wilson in Vietnam, for example, Harold Wilson not getting Britain involved in the Vietnam War. Occasionally you get these flashes of independence, but broadly speaking, you are entirely aligned with whoever happens to be in charge in the White House at any given point in time. To the point of making yourself really desperately unpopular. Like Blair in 2003 facing, at the time, the biggest protests in British history over Iraq, still went along with the Iraq war and has tried to brazen it out ever since. And he's never been able to escape this. It's absolutely ruined him politically, domestically. He can't ever get away from what happened there. But that's because he tried to brazen it out in the teeth of these protests. What he had this time round was a Labour Party that was already visibly weak and already knew it was weak in a way that Blair in 2003 just wasn't. He went on to win the next election, reduced majority, but he still won. That's not, I would not put money on Labour doing that this time round, put it this way. So they were already weak, they're already exposed, and now they're confronted by this major international crisis. There are other internal bits going on. I mean, Keir Starmer is having problems defining himself in a kind of post-Morgan McSweeney world. Not that defining himself in a Morgan McSweeney world did him any great favours. I mean, it's just this sort of mess. Really extraordinary things you've seen from this government. What on earth? They knew from the end of 2022 that they were going to win the next election. And now I'm allowing people a bit of superstition that they might not want to think about this, but you still have to plan for it. What was their plan? They wandered into this loveless landslide, this huge majority where they could have done basically anything they felt like. That's the British parliamentary system. You get a majority like that, you can do anything, particularly in the first flush of having won the election. And what did? They did nothing, and then they took away the winter fuel payments. Oh, and then Rachel Reeves popped up in the middle somewhere to tell everyone how bad it was, but didn't say what she was going to do about it. I mean, it's just incredible. And that's when his popularity starts to drain away. The only stories you got was Keir Starmer likes a nice suit that his friends buy him. Only he likes going to, was it Taylor Swift concerts? This sort of list of
That's
freebies.
all we got for months, right? Silk ties and Taylor Swift.
That's the only story you get. And then, by the way, we're going to freeze a few pensioners over Christmas. I mean, this is just nonsense. What on earth were they playing at? And that has pretty much defined Starmer since. I don't think he's ever going to be able to escape just those first few months.
Do you think that was a political failure or a failure of strategic communications? Because some people might say, you know what, James, you're entirely right. That was a failure of how they sequenced things and, they thought they had 3 or 4 months to take stock of the situation. That's what Rachel Reeves would say, for instance. When actually they should have done what they're kind of doing now, in my opinion anyway, which is to announce a deluge of very minor stuff, which is very popular, fireworks being, less noisy, for instance, while also doing really major stuff, which actually might be a bit more divisive, but fundamentally keep people really fixed on the minor, more popular stuff that gets on the front page of the Sun and the Mail and the Express. So where was the failure there? Was it strategic communications or policy?
No, it's a failure of political strategy. Political strategy is a sort of one that gets overdone, right? The supposed genius of Morgan McSweeney is not that much of a genius involved here, which is that you could have had the proverbial plank of wood running as leader of the Labour Party by 2024, and you may not have got quite as big a majority, but you would have still won that majority. So the strategic genius of Morgan McSweeney is overdone. What he's good at is fighting a kind of internal factional battle. He's demonstrably good at that in all sorts of, we've all read The Fraud by this point, all sorts of questionable ways. But then anything beyond that point, like how do you actually run a government? And by the way, you can't do it in sort of 1990s vibes. This isn't how this is going to work. You can't go and admire your box set of The West Wing or pretend you're, Alistair Campbell or whatever it might be. This isn't going to happen.
Did nobody say that to them beforehand?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. You feel like there must have been. There's also a degree to which there's a degree to which they presumably just believe their own stuff, right? They kind of hide their own supply a little bit here, which is that the real problems in Britain is that we just had these chancers and these ne'er-do-wells in charge for a few years called the Conservative Party. And if we get them out of the way, the Rolls-Royce machine of the British state and the British economy will roar into gear again, just as it did in the 1990s. This is their story. And of course, that isn't the case at all. You can't put at the top of a machine that doesn't work a different driver and expect the machine to work. Machine isn't working. The state isn't working, and the economy isn't working. So if you go, hey, we've just got this sort of rather dull lawyer to run it rather than whoever you want to pick from the Conservative Party, you don't get fundamentally different results. You get the same results. And I think there was a degree to which they simply believed, partly because if you go and do the access talks with the civil service, which, back to talking about, I don't want to spend too long talking about Jeremy Corbyn's time as leader of the Labour Party, but in the run-up to the 2017 election, you go for the access talks with the senior civil servants. And having been, perhaps for my sins, a civil servant once upon a time, sitting in the Treasury, so you kind of know what these people are like, the senior civil service. And they're extremely nice, and they're very charming, and they're very smart. start, and they'll tell you all sorts of things you definitely want to hear about what's going to happen when you arrive in government. And you can sit there, especially if you don't have any experience of government, and very few people in Labour actually have experience of government. There's a few knocking around, Yvette Cooper, for example. Very few of them actually have that experience. And it seems great, because you're being given this very nice presentation by some super effective operators about how everything's going to be just fine. And you can believe that, and you think everything's going to be just fine. And of course it's not, because those super effective operators, and let's be quite clear about this, not because they're bad people or whatever, that's not the point here. There is a systemic problem. And the systemic problem includes the operation of the senior civil service, and in particular, the role of the Treasury in the heart of the system of government that we have.
So basically, what should have happened is there should have been an instinctive skepticism from people around Starmer,
Yes,
saying, well, that sounds great, maybe it's true, but I'm not going to just believe you by default, but they did. What about reform? So I suppose that opens up a question regarding them as well. Do you think they've been hurt by their response to the Iran war?
Yes.
And also, if the Treasury and the civil service is so good at basically nullifying political dissent, political change fundamentally via the Democratic Party system, do you think they would also do that to reform? Do you think Farage and Tice and Z Yusuf will just be mesmerised in the same way that Keir Starmer was before 2024?
Reform are doing it to themselves. I mean, this has been the case for the last, probably about the last year, 6 months. How long has Zack Polanski been leader of the Green Party?
6 months plus, right?
Just about 6 months. So, and you could see it going that way already. That reform is gradually dropping its pretense. It's still there in fits and starts. You still get Nigel Farage trying to talk about how they're going to reopen coal mines and steel furnaces in South Wales for the purposes of the elections there. There's still bits of that. But you don't get Nigel Farage telling people what an admirer he always secretly was of Arthur Scargill, as he was doing about 12 months ago. You know, you don't get him popping up outside steelworks in the north of England, waving a union placard and saying, hey, we're going to renationalise this. You don't have that bit of reform where it's making a genuine effort to provide a kind of populist hegemony, where you go, we are right wing over here and we're left wing over there, and we're going to present this to everyone, and we're going to absolutely mop up every single vote we can get. And partly you don't get them doing that is because there is now a credible left wing pole of attraction which blocks that left part of it. So they're already facing a political challenge, which is that it is difficult for them to look left wing if somebody else is there saying, hey, I'm really left wing, which is the Greens.
But hold on, you're saying they're neutering, because I actually agree with you on that, but you're also saying that they're neutering themselves.
Yes.
Rather than the Treasury doing it ahead of a general election.
Because,
so where does that fit into that explanation?
Well, that's the political part. The political bit is that it's harder for them to do the presentation of populism. Like, we're all things to all people. You don't like immigrants, we don't like immigrants. You want steelworks nationalised, we'll nationalise the steelworks. Hey, we're not going to do austerity. Everything for everybody, right? Regardless of where you sit in the political spectrum, everybody gets everything. That's being cut off. The lefty bit of that, such as it was, and it was never convincing or genuine, it's gone. The other part of it is they now face this strategic problem, which is as they advance towards power, they are not, in fact, going to win their 40% of the vote. They need to just win a majority and get on with it. They're having to deal with the Conservative Party. They're having to deal with the backers of the Conservative Party. That very revealing report in the Financial Times. And what a good newspaper it is, really, for these sorts of things, of Nigel Farage meeting some very, very wealthy individuals. And it was a leaked account of that meeting where he basically says, look, don't worry too much about what we're saying, right? We're not actually going to rock the boat. And P.S., we need your money, which is where he's getting the big money donations coming in. So there's a structural part of it. And that starts to turn into not Richard Tice saying, hey, we're going to change the relationship between the Bank of England and the Treasury. We're not going to indemnify the Bank of England for its notional losses. Suddenly that sort of talk is dropped. You suddenly get talking up, instead of no austerity, everybody gets everything plus tax cuts. It's like, actually the books are going to have to balance, therefore austerity and then tax cuts. And that's what you're promising. And you can still try and make this work if you lard it with, to be blunt, a load of variants of racism. You sort of do a load of immigrant bashing of various sorts. You say indefinite leave to remain, it's all gone, we're going to deport people. I mean, it's totally obnoxious, but you do it. But the challenge they now face is that even that bit is under pressure, because you have Rupert Lowe's operation chewing away at the right-hand side of it, calling Nigel Farage a sellout, So this is a real squeeze that they're facing at this point in time. And their retreat position is to align themselves with the kind of core of the British state and hope for the best. And that is aligning yourself with failure. That's aligning yourself with a decade or more of failure easily at this point.
That is such an astute way of putting it. I mean, obviously, reform have benefited massively from the balkanisation of the party system in this country. But I think it was obviously a matter of time before the same thing happened to them. What's really surprised me is it's happening before they're anywhere near government. The restore thing is the kind of thing that happens 2 years into having a parliamentary majority and some renegade George Galloway of the right, aka Rupert Lowe, breaks free. But they haven't done that. And normally what disciplines people is power, right? The pursuit of power, which is surprising that they've already, and they are set right now to be the largest party in Westminster. Maybe not a majority, we'll see. But that's not been the adhesive which has kept things together, which I think to some extent does surprise me. This idea as well about them just basically defaulting to the norms of the British state, plus a bit of immigrant bashing. The only radical element that remains, I suppose, which is at odds with the British state, one might argue, is actually their proximity to Trump.
Yes.
You know, they're so close to Trump, it's almost becoming irrational. And you see this with GB News as well, right? I see GB News presenters and whatnot, some of whom I'm pretty sure are going to be parliamentary candidates for a form of the next general election, retweeting, you know, this is game theory, trust Trump, etc., etc., etc. When you know that the chiefs of the general staff, the British Army, you know, RUSI, MI6, etc., they're not that dumb. So it's almost like Reform are embracing the worst of both worlds. You know, the only bit of change they may be looking at realistically is the bit that actually the British state isn't interested in, which is moving further away from Europe and ever greater dependence on the US.
I mean, I don't know if that decision is made by the British state at this point in time, right? And it hasn't really been able to come to a decisive conclusion about it over the last decade or so since Trump won his first election. As I said, if you've got now, 70-odd year alignment where you go, whoever's running America, we kind of line up with them. And that's just how the world is. And you can make a case that at various points this has worked very well for Britain, that alignment with America, that, you know, we've ended up, take the 2000s, the alignment with America, the provision of a kind of offshore financial trading centre, provided for a period of very decent economic growth in this country and all the various benefits that various centrist dads will forever tell you about under New Labour. That was an alignment with America. And unfortunately, it all went absolutely haywire after about 2001. But for a few years, you kind of got that thing. And then you can make the case it actually carried on all the way through to 2007 or so. That's the alignment with America. That's what you get out of it. But that's falling away. And it's not just falling away in a kind of, we have a US president who's a bit wayward, which you might say is the case of George W. Bush. It's like we have not only a US president who is wayward and then some in the form of Donald Trump relative to the norms of America. We have a US president who's openly talking about and treats with contempt the foundational institutions of the entire post-World War II liberal democratic settlement in the Western world, which Labour is categorically a part of. NATO was a Labour invention, right? This is where the drive to set that thing up comes from. And if you then have a US president say, I'm not so bothered about this anymore, or a vice president, J.D. Vance, I noticed visiting Hungary, saying that, hey, Europeans, you're all on your own. Like the entire structure that the Labour Party is a part of, as the second party the British state is fundamentally a part of, is breaking down in front of it. And that's a threat even to the very basis of social democracy in this country, right? That's the kind of big shift you're looking at.
I buy all of that. And so to be clear, let me rephrase what I'm saying, because I don't for 1 minute think that the British deep state wants to break with America. I do think there is an acknowledgement that they need to diversify this country's security apparatus doctrine.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, in addition to that, when you see somebody like Elon Musk, world's wealthiest person, worth $750 billion, buying X, and he is amplifying voices who are talking about the possibility of civil war in the United Kingdom, and people like Farage are very close to that part of the US elite. I mean, it seems self-evident to me that the deep state in this country thinks, well, hang on, this is a bit much. Surely.
Well, I think so. No, I think you're right. And I think this is an unsettled, open question as to what Britain as a state should do next, which, by the way, I mean, Adam Ramsey's raised this. He writes very well about these sort of constitutional issues that quietly, at least if you're sitting in Westminster or if you're sitting in England, like the United Kingdom itself is under a significant question again. The rise in support for independence in Scotland and Wales, actually going back over a number of years. The likelihood now of Plaid being the biggest party in the Senate come the elections. The SNP sort of staging another comeback in Scotland. Various versions of what's happening in the north of Ireland with questions raised there about long-term future of that particular part of the United Kingdom. This is all being thrown open in a way that we've seen throughout the last, we were just saying we've known each other for about 15 odd years. For that entire period, 16 years, is that for that entire period of time, all of this has been something of an open question. And it has never been properly resolved. Brexit didn't resolve it. Brexit just complicated things even more. And it's never been resolved. And it's possibly it never gets resolved with the existing setup of the British state as a United Kingdom. That might well be a future in 20 years' time, right? Or even shorter. But what you're not getting is, in particular, a version of a resolution of all of this from within the British state or the two main parties closest to the British state, I would say. Labour doesn't have a resolution for this and the Tories don't have a resolution for this. So suddenly you get parties outside of that, Reform and the Greens, which potentially start to offer some versions of a resolution.
You said about the US world order clearly facing a crisis of some kind. I don't think what's happened in Iran is necessarily Suez. I think a better analogy is probably this is going to sound like inside baseball, the fall of Singapore. It doesn't feel like the end, but it feels like maybe the beginning of the end. And lots of people realizing actually the invincible, indomitable American empire is none of those things, which is what happened to British power in Asia after 1940-41. But I suppose somebody watching or listening to this from the right, a pro-defense person who says we need to spend 5% of GDP on defense, etc., they would say, you know what, James, I agree with you. That US-led unipolarity is over. Doesn't mean America's kaput or it's going to, break apart, but it's no longer the only kid on the block. You've already acknowledged that actually, to some extent, post-war social democracy rested upon American unipolarity. It gave Britain a privileged place in terms of global production chains and defense arrangements, etc., energy arrangements, etc. But what's the green answer to any of that? Because all Zack Polanski can do is talk down the US-led world order, which, by the way, is just breaking up anyway, and you're not offering an alternative. The only alternative you're offering is to say, well, we shouldn't spend more on defence. But surely we should be spending more on defence if that's what actually is, unfolding.
Should we be spending more on defence? So I think one of the things Iran has answered is...
I wouldn't say that. No.
I know where you're going with this.
A right-wing critic would say, I actually agree with you about all of this stuff, but the problem is your party doesn't really have any proposals about what we should do.
Well, let's take the positive case, and I'll come back to the actual money question on that, which is, look, the positive case, the bit that is problematic for people saying, hey, if NATO's going, we should leave NATO, we should just do something else, is that if you look around the world at countries that are just trying to be neutral or trying to not be aligned with some other defence arrangement, they tend to spend more on defence, right? It's just, and particularly, and it's going to be a very difficult argument when you're looking at the world as it is, with a clear rise in military spending across the world, increasing number of conflicts, that sort of thing. It's a very hard argument to say we're just going to drop out of all of this and also cut our defence spending, right? In conventional terms, that's challenging. Because broadly speaking, it's going to be really difficult to overcome the argument that says, okay, we no longer have some overarching defence umbrella like NATO or whatever, therefore we're on our own, therefore we have to spend more. That will be the argument that you're up against at this point in time. There's a couple of counters to that. The most obvious one is what we've all seen happening. We had a preview of this with the Houthis in the Red Sea over 2024 into 2025, by the way, when you had, in their case, drones that had Garmin GPS guidance and bits of kit you could buy from Germany or China for the little engine that you put in it, and they were shutting down a major artery of the world's entire trade. It's 10% of global seaborne trade goes through the Suez Canal, right? Just closed by people armed with $2,000 drones. Iran's Shahed drone, the cheapest one's about $20,000. The US Navy missile.
Some people say even less, right? Some people say $5,000.
These things, the figures sort of vary up and down. The main one is that this is a lot less than the $4 million anti-drone missile that the US Navy is using to try and hit them and is now running out of. So what we're seeing is that this traditional view, certainly the post-World War II view, and coming out of the creation of a defence industrial complex, which is, you start to see it being pieced together in the First World War, but it becomes an overwhelming fact in the total war of the Second World War and then continuing into the Cold War, the military-industrial complex. The traditional view is you pump more money into that, you get more good stuff out the other end, and this is how defence is going to work, right? And, all right, you can muck around with guerrilla warfare or whatever, but it's not really decisive. Decisive defence is big spending, big kit. Your military-industrial complex provides close alignment with the state. That's what it all looks like. Now, it doesn't look like that anymore. Iran demonstrates that, and actually Ukraine demonstrates this to a significant extent, their effective use of drones against a much, much larger, much, much bigger spending Russian military machine. So if the world isn't going to depend for defence on just handing over massive amounts of money to your defence industrial complex and its associated army and navy and the rest, we have to think a bit more seriously about what we're doing and what we're doing in a world where the old order is breaking down so visibly. I think part of that is going to end up looking like new kinds of alliances. And the most obvious one is, what does a European alliance look like that might actually work for this country? That's what it's going to end up. That's what we're going to get to. But is the answer to this just make that big number for defence go up and up and up without asking any serious questions about what we're spending on and for what purposes and how a war's being actually fought nowadays? I don't think that's sustainable.
I mean, just to be clear about my views, I agree with you entirely. We have a huge defence budget of 60 billion a year, about 10 billion euro more than the French, who seem to get much more for their money. So I think before you start adding money to the defence budget, you need to be justifying what you're spending, which we can't. We need to obviously massively reform procurement. The kit we buy doesn't seem to work a lot of the time. So I agree with you on all of that. But I suppose big picture is that the demise of US empire does make the borderlands of US empire more vulnerable. And what are those borderlands? The Gulf states, we've just seen what's happening to them. You know, Kuwait and Bahrain might not exist in a few years. And if they do, it's going to be because of new defense arrangements and security arrangements. It's parts of East Asia, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. This week we've had one of the politicians from the KMT visit Beijing. They're talking about quote-unquote reconciliation. And of course, it's Europe, but really Eastern Europe. You know, the Baltic states, Ukraine obviously has already happened. To some extent, Germany, Poland already spends a ton on defense. I don't really know what else it could do. But Europe, East Asia and the Gulf are these really exposed parts of the world where as US unipolarity diminishes, clearly they're going to have new arrangements, and you're talking about new alliances and spending money better. And I think that's right, and I agree with you. But it does feel that the default political line from the Green Party is no more war, no more defence spending. We don't even need to think about these things actually. Which again, to ventriloquize a right-wing critic of you and I, they might say, well, that's a luxury belief. No war and let's negotiate with Putin and let's spend less on defence is a luxury belief from the last 40 years, which is itself ironically based on presumptions of US unipolarity.
I mean, look, this is an obvious parody of a Green position and a broader sort of pacifist tradition, which has an intellectual backing to it if you take it seriously. It's not one I particularly agree with, but there is like a serious case to be made for thinking around this. What's interesting about the Greens is that I think, and this is quite exciting, I think there's a lot of new thinking coming forward that when you have a party of 200,000 and so people, you get people from all walks of life, you get people with military backgrounds, you get people with lots of experience in thinking about these questions, thinking seriously about it. And because the Greens internal policy making is so wildly democratic to a fault, it can actually start to turn pretty rapidly into what green policy looks like. And I think some of that is starting to feed through, and I think we'll start to see it over the next year or so. As you start to get a Green Party policy position, which is something closer to what a genuinely progressive, left-leaning government in the world we actually inhabit would start to do, rather than one where you say, one day in the future, it would be nice to have no more war, right? I think that's what you're going to get towards. You can see it already. I thought Zack Polanski's piece for the New Statesman, probably about 2 months ago, I mean, before the Iran war really, well before it kicked off, talking about how, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but it's not Zack Polanski that's doing over NATO, it's Donald Trump, it's the US. And when I say Donald Trump, right, it's an entire Washington alignment behind him. We can talk about this, just how quickly it's shifted behind Trump and the Trump presidency. There is a strategy there, particularly on the economic side, around a person, Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary in particular. Trump is more erratic, as of us speaking, just seen. But Zack's article made a case, without giving much in the way of detail, for what a realignment of defence and security and foreign policy might look like in a future Britain, in a world that looks like the one we do. Now, that is a good point to get to, because that means you're starting to go from describing where you'd like to be at some point in the future, and we would all like to live in a world without war, and what you're going to do when you're actually in government in about 3 years' time, right? And there's a world of difference between those two things, unfortunately. So you're going to have to close that gap, and you're going to have to do it in as best a way as possible that makes sense, that aligns with the values you want and matches reality that we're up against.
So watch this space on defence and defence policy and industrial policy, how those two relate. I want to talk about the Greens a lot. We're going to talk about the Greens a lot in a minute, but I've got one more question about these broad sort of political issues and ideas. why do we keep getting things wrong? We've already mentioned that we've been friends for 16 years. For the best part of 2 decades, we've been told that the economy would grow. It was just a blip. We were told with the Russia-Ukraine war that Russia being blocked from SWIFT and various institutions and banks being sanctioned would mean that the Russian economy would collapse, maybe Putin would go, that the war would be stopped because of the United States weaponizing the global economy against various rivals. We were told that China technologically couldn't catch up. It would always be able to manufacture cheap goods at scale, but it could never out-innovate the West. We were told that Iran certainly wouldn't be able to defend itself in the manner it has over the last month. Now, people watching might be thinking, well, I knew that on 1 or 2 of those things, maybe all of them, well done. But that certainly wasn't the worldview of The Economist magazine, of senior civil servants, of decision makers in Washington, London, and Brussels. Why do these people who are so influential, who think they're so smart, keep getting these really important questions wrong?
I mean, the short answer is I'm told, I think it's a letter by T.S. Eliot where he references it, so it must be true. There's an Icelandic saying that everyone likes the smell of their own farts. And that's kind of the problem of ideology, which is you will say these things, and there's a certain part of the function of saying these things is to convince other people. But there's a significant part, which is that it's to convince yourself. And it's quite hard. I think it's a somewhat lazy answer from me, but it's quite hard to avoid the degree to which self-delusion has played a part in all of this. And the nuance on that, or the proviso on that, is that we have to be careful if we're sitting in Britain talking like this, because Britain's been unusually bad. It's performed unusually badly economically for a kind of major advanced economy, I mean, worse really out of the G7, over a sustained period of time. One of the worst in the OECD, I reckon. And it also has the most kind of deluded set of sort of senior state managers and senior capitalists and the most delusions about its own status and role in the world, which is reproduced over and over again. I mean,
why? Why is Britain so peculiarly delusional? Because I think most people would probably agree with that.
Because we went, my short version of that is I think we went furthest into believing that globalisation really would be, as Blair said in the 2005 Labour conference, something you couldn't disagree with. It'd be like trying to disagree with the coming of the spring, right? It was like pretending the seasons weren't going to happen. P.S. Here we all are and the seasons are all over the place. And so globalisation is on its way out. So Blair kind of wrong in 2 respects there. But the important one for this conversation is that a rock-solid belief that the world was globalised, that Britain had negotiated itself in a feat of sort of brilliant state management, managed to get itself by around about, call it 2001, 2000, let's say, to a position where it was perfectly positioned to take full advantage of this globalised world. It didn't need a domestic manufacturing base. That was all disappearing under Thatcher, disappeared again under Blair, right? You're down to nothing. Not quite. By the time he leaves office, one part of it, you have this whacking great financial system, which deals in money from all over the rest of the world, and you cream a bit off of that. And some of that goes to kind of private benefit, particularly in the South East. And when you have new Labour in office, a lot of it goes into public benefit in terms of significant amount of redistribution into public services across the rest of the country. And so you can sit in the early 2000s and think, we have it absolutely made. Faster growth than everywhere else in Europe. I think at various points, faster growth in the US. This is like, we are absolutely sitting pretty. And you're completely locked into these structures. And when they all steadily fall away, of which the 2008 crisis is the most decisive, you do not react in a way that says we're going to course correct and do something else. Partly because in 2008 happens, there is a genuine belief that you could kind of pay your way out of this and everything will carry on in some form. But then you're hit by a series of other crises related to globalisation. The pandemic's related to globalisation. It becomes a pandemic because we have a large amount of travel taking place around the world and it spreads quickly, therefore, right? That's how the virus spreads. It's related to globalisation. And the response to it is a breakdown of globalisation. You then get the breakdowns of globalisation because Russia invades Ukraine and the stable world order that was supposed to exist and borders respected, at least by some countries, specifically in and around Europe, it disappears. You get these series of challenges which there is no capacity, or at least we are so locked in. Let me put it this way. We are so locked into the older way of operating, and enough people are still making enough money out of that older way of operating. If you're in financial services in London, you're still doing pretty much all right. Like, you've been kind of cushioned from the worst of 2008. You've been protected to a certain extent there. It's not quite as brilliant as it was. There are certain rules and regulations about what you can and can't do. It's not as extensive an operation as it used to be. Brexit was a challenge, but you're still there, you're still doing okay. And you're still close enough, specifically, to this government and its Chancellor of the Exchequer, so that, again, we know, Financial Times, a leaked report of people from the Treasury before last year's budget meeting senior figures in financial services saying, please can you talk up how good this budget is and how good this government is because we have not increased your taxes. Even though banks are making all-time record profits at the minute because interest rates have gone up, and that's what happens if you run a bank and interest rates go up, right? So there's enough lock-in to not actually move out of this. The structures lock us into this. And so we fail and fail and fail, but some people do okay.
I remember doing an event, I think it was just after the 2017 election, and there was a very prominent person from, I believe it was the Economist magazine, and they were saying, Corbyn cannot be the Prime Minister. And ultimately they were right.
Yeah.
He wasn't the Prime Minister. But I just remember saying to them, well, how do you know? I mean, obviously you can talk about probabilities, but your job at The Economist is to inform your readers, and you have to work out a range of scenarios. Well, if he does become the PM, what does that mean? What are the implications? What are the upsides? What are the downsides? But it's almost like they viewed their job as foreclosing certain things from even being possible.
Yep.
But by the way, we're blindsided by things every day of the week. I mean, I just talked about some really big macro ones. And I think your answer about Britain going in deepest when it came to this ideology of the end of history and post-industrial, modernity, et cetera, I think that's entirely right. It's very easy to forget. In one quarter of 2007, I believe, 3 of the largest 10 companies in the world by market cap were British. HSBC, Shell and BP, right?
Yeah.
You go look at the top 10 companies now. It's very different industries, overwhelmingly United States, digital technology firms. Taiwan with TSMC has a company, I think, worth about $1 trillion, worth much more than any company in Europe, certainly. It's a very different world. And I suppose I look at Britain in 2026 and I just think we have made so many bad bets over 20, 25 years. The French made some bad bets. They made some good bets. Actually, they made a lot more good bets than we did. Taiwan made some really good bets. South Korea made some really good bets. Japan made some really good bets. China made a ton of good bets, made some bad ones, one-child policy. But I look at Britain, I think we just haven't made any.
Yeah.
For basically most of my life. We've made so many bad bets. It's almost like we're trying to make bad bets. And I agree with your analysis of why we keep on failing. But it does seem, like I say, it's peculiarly British. And there's just something so extraordinary about it. I feel like it must be more than ideology.
It is.
I can't quite put my finger on it, please.
Well, let's be clear. I mean, look, the ideology is a part of the self-justification of this. I think it's an easy explanation to get to, but it's wrong as a complete explanation, right? The actual problem here is a material basis for what is the structure of the British economy and what do important centres of power look like and who do they talk to and where do they get their power and status and wealth from, right? That's a material basis of the economy.
Can I interrupt you there? So is the emphasis on London a big part of this as well?
Yeah.
Because, in the United States, you've got Silicon Valley, you've got New York, you've got Texas, you've got Florida, you've got multiple poles of politics and economics and technology and culture. And if one's wrong about something, somebody else can try something else and they're proven right.
Yes, and you go across Europe and the bigger economies all have that kind of feature of polycentricity, to use the word, right? You have, one large capital city. Paris is a lot bigger than every other French city, but there's a lot going on in other French cities. And they all have lots of powers that cities in this country don't have. But they have a wildly centralised system of government, which just reinforces this London bias. And when we say London, it's not, I live in a sort of, I'm standing for election in a classic example of it, where one half of Tower Hamlets is the London that gets the attention because it's Canary Wharf. And the other half of Tower Hamlets is a London that does not get the attention because it's some of the most deprived wards in the entire country, right? And that's the inequality that's even produced in a single London borough. So when we say London, it's a bit of a shorthand for a particular kind and particular parts of London with particular people doing particular jobs. Most of London isn't really seeing much out of this, and indeed is suffering the backwash effects of everything being really expensive and difficult, right? That's the actual impact of trying to cram all economic activity into a single capital city in the way that we have been doing. But the material part of this is what's driving this, right? And that's why it's so hard to unpick. And that's not, I don't make that point just because I think it's important to be right because, hey, isn't it nice being right? I think it also has political consequences. One of the weaknesses with Corbynism was something we were able to exploit at the time, knowingly or otherwise. But Corbynism arises during this weird period of like the lowest interest rates in human history. And an incredibly low rate of inflation.
Right at the midpoint, right? So it starts in 2010, ends in 2020, and it's like...
It's bang. So that makes life easy, right? You can just go, do you know what? We should just borrow a load of money because at this interest rate, negative real interest rates, even with the low inflation, markets are pretty much asking to give you money. They want to give you money. So you can borrow a load of money and repair things, and you're just going to do that. And that means the deeper questions about inequality, where's the wealth tax in Corbynism? It's not there. About reform of the state. I mean, what are we going to do to make the state work differently? Where's electoral reform? Where's how are you going to change the Treasury and this sort of thing? I mean, that's an interesting sideline in that, which is the Treasury is a continual problem part of the British state for anybody who's remotely radical from any direction, right? It's just take it as read. I think the Lib Dems now want to break it up, so well done them. We had Bob Kerslake, who is a brilliant man, a brilliant public servant, and just a really lovely guy, and who supported. He was a very senior civil servant, and it still says something about British state. People like him could rise to positions of seniority inside the state. But we commissioned him to write a report on what to do with the Treasury. And he came back with an answer which was good for the time, but bad for now, which is that you should take the Treasury and clutch it closely to what you want to do and use it to deliver what you want, right? And it's very similar to the answer that Gordon Brown had a decade and more before. But that's not reforming the state, right? That's exploiting these peculiar circumstances of globally low interest rates, globally low inflation to say we can repair things without getting into deeper questions. We are no longer in that world. So anybody who wants to make this country work better has to immediately start to address the question of how does the state operate and what do we do about inequality? Which is why I think the break that the Greens represent with the existing party system, with the alignment of those parties with the British state, is a much more important moment than Corbynism, which was something that happened inside one of those parties of the state that didn't really question the functioning of the state. The Greens also, by the way, are in favour of at least referendum in Scotland on independence, for example, right? Which is something that Labour never had, a really fundamental change in how the state would operate. So it's a bigger shift, and it's a necessarily bigger shift because we no longer have the luxury of being able to say, we'll just borrow £250 billion, to hell with it, we can do that, right? It's almost free money. In fact, it is free money that we're being given right now. We're in much harder, more constrained circumstances. So you have to be more radical in the real sense of what are you going to do to alter the structures than Corbynism ever was.
Is that the case, though? Because somebody like Zack Polanski, who I think is a very talented politician, I think he's a smart person. I think he'll adapt as circumstances change. I think he'll seize political opportunities. These are all very good things. But somebody like Zack Polanski, at the moment, and it can change for all the reasons I just said, but at the moment, Zack Polanski, confronted with a problem, will say, we should tax the rich. And if there's a problem, we should spend more money on it. Right? And what you're saying is actually, no, because of at the end of effectively 0% interest rates, we need to think strategically about what the state can do, can't do. We need to actually look for efficiencies. That shouldn't be a right-coded pursuit. But these are all quite different to the kind of continuity anti-austerity politics, economics that we hear from Zack Polanski, right? In many ways, Zack Polanski does sound actually like a continuation of Corbyn and McDonnell. Tax the rich, spend the money on the poor, spend more money on the welfare state. Oh, the NHS isn't achieving certain outcomes. Spend more money on the NHS, even though actually we've increased NHS funding quite substantially since 2020 as a country. So am I being unfair to Zack Polanski, or is it a work in progress? Or
Well, it's two bits. I think firstly there's a work in progress, and you can see his focus on the cost of living. The Greens' focus on the cost of living is a route into deeper questions about how markets operate in this country. We are going to end up with a more developed we're going to have to. And I think either this government will do it in an organised way or a disorganised way, a deeper conversation about price controls and strategic reserves and these sorts of things to deal with a world where you just have continual shocks. That's where we're going to end up.
Strategic reserves of things like petroleum.
Yeah, well, which we have. The gas that we have 2 days worth of supply. But also, we used to have strategic reserves of food. We closed them all down in the mid-1990s because it's the end of the Cold War and, hey, everything's going to be globalised and the market will always provide forever. It doesn't matter anymore. But we import 40% of the food that we eat, 60% of the fertilizer. So it would be a good idea if you're suddenly looking at the risk of significant price shocks from the rest of the world, having some sort of reserve for when that happens. I mean, it's what China does, for example, it's what India does. You have to look at the developing world to think of some good versions of this, but clearly we're going to have something like that here. This is a conversation that the Greens, because of where they come from, the particular route to the creation of the Green Party coming out of the environmental movement is very well placed to talk about. And that's why I think it's exciting, because you're not having this is something people talk about. Oh, you've got to break with Labourism, the ideology of Labour. You've got to have a break with this kind of, the older versions of we are attached to the British state. We're the second party of the British state. It's Labourism. It's somewhat subordinate. It goes all the way back to Perry Anderson, writing in the 1960s about why does Labour always fail? Why is it so pathetic? It's this sort of ideology of Labourism. It's another glorious defeat. The people's flag is deepest red. It's shrouded oft our martyred dead. I mean, this is not exactly to arms citizens, is it, right? The ideology of the thing is always subordinate. It's always like we're just going to plough along and try to get something out of this. The Greens don't come from that. It's a break with it. It's quite a hard break with that particular sort of social democratic past. And it comes from the environmental movement where questions of shortages, actual material shortages, arrive pretty front and centre of what you're thinking about. That the natural world is not just a given out of which you can exploit. It can respond to what you're doing in various unpleasant ways, which is basically what climate change is. If you come from a world where you think like that, this is a more interesting place in dealing with the problems we face, many of which have exactly that character, than if you come from a world of like abundance forever, growth will be continuous, we'll just sort of plod along in our slightly subordinate fashion. Every decade or so we're allowed to run the government and that's nice for a bit and then we're out, right? That's a kind of Labourist version of what to do, of which Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was a part, right? It was absolutely in that sort of tradition because it didn't question the state. Didn't have serious plans to reform the state. There were bits and bobs, but not much there. It wasn't front and centre. Certainly didn't do much about wealth inequality specifically. It was like Jeremy Corbyn gets into Downing Street, pulls a big old lever, currently jammed at neoliberalism, yoinks it in the direction of social democracy, and it's all good. And to this extent, it was much closer to New Labour than many people involved in Corbynism would like to admit, because it was another version of how to do social democracy. Yeah, in sort of different post-2008 circumstances, but that's what it was. We're no longer in that world.
Just moving a few macroeconomic dials.
Yeah. Exactly.
The thing about strategic reserves is a really extraordinary one. And I think what you just said there, again, I think this is important to repeat. The ideological propensities of the Greens, given that the movement they come from, actually leave them uniquely placed to offer a formidable industrial policy for the 21st century, which I think most people, again, from the right or who are sceptical of the Greens, wouldn't actually think that at first glance, but it makes sense to me and it certainly sounds coherent. The thing about strategic reserves, I only found this out the other day. The United States has 2 to 3 months of rare earth minerals, and each F-35 has hundreds of kilos of rare earths. But the ideological aversion to those kinds of strategic reserves, having processing in the United States, etc., they can't do it. I'm sure eventually they're going to have to do it, but it's taking them a really long time.
Well, let's be careful in that. This is where the US state looks a lot more dynamic than British.
Well, it's certainly pivoting a lot more quickly on
Trump announcement at the start of this year that they're going to be setting up strategic minerals reserves, and they've got some named locations for them. They're going to be building them up, and they're going to start to process everything inside the United States, because otherwise it's 90% of this stuff has to go through China if you want it processed.
But it's 25 years late. That's what's fascinating.
Yeah. It's hurrying to catch up. And by the way, if you want to make a strategic reserve right now, which is kind of when you need it, this is the worst possible time to do it because everything's wildly expensive, right? It's a daft time to try and do this. Might not be a bad idea on some sort of foodstuffs of various sorts, or I would say fertiliser, but the price of that's gone through the roof. So, you kind of have to hope this calms down a bit and then you can build up reserves when things are cheap. But, China's the one who leads the world in this. But Japan has massive reserves of various essentials. South Korea has this.
I think Japan,
much of the world thinks like this already. Right?
Japan has 9 months of petrol. Yeah. It's 9 months. I think per capita has the highest reserves of petrol in the world. Because, obviously it's a very industrial economy, very energy intense. And
massively import dependent for its energy. PS, another island on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, is also very energy import dependent for its energy, right? 50% of the natural gas we use. I mean, that was another big gamble in the 80s into the 90s that kind of paid off for a bit and then didn't, which is we'll just get all the gas we want out of the North Sea. That's brilliant. We'll just do this. You end up with this whacking great dependence on 50% of your natural gas imports come from the rest of the world. Norway mostly, and a fair bit, a certain amount comes from the Middle East in liquefied natural gas form. And then, of course, you get Donald Trump kindly offering to, sell with strings attached some of America's oversupply of LNG. But that's where we actually live. We are actually dependent on many other things in a way that's not very comfortable for people here. And it means that when you have shocks in the rest of the world, they translate quite rapidly into people's standards of living here because we do not have those reserves. We do not have that resilience. And the party that's thought about this, out of the set of the 5 or so main parties that we now have, historically, has been the Greens.
I buy that to some extent. If you look at lithium as well, after the end of the Cold War, the Americans had a huge supply of lithium. Again, it was important for their military-industrial complex, and they just sell all of it. And actually, the price of lithium collapses after the end of the Cold War. And the Chinese, again, I'm reading a great book about this at the moment, and the Chinese are just kind of looking at each other going, why would they do this? But it's remarkable that, of course, America's on it now, but it's taken, decades, and it's questionable if they can actually gain the upper hand with regards to any of this. I suppose Richard Tice or Zia Yusuf, or even, dare I say, Nigel Farage, would watch or listen to this and they would hear what you're saying about energy dependence.
Yes.
And they would be thumping the table. They'd say, you bloody Greens! You don't want us to use our coal deposits. Britain does have huge coal deposits. China presently consumes more coal than the rest of the world put together. We have North Sea oil and gas. We have sources of energy which we could extract via fracking.
Yep.
We might have a few earthquakes in Blackpool, but it's a price to pay. That's what they would say. So we could actually be energy independent if we wanted to be. It's not just them that say that, by the way. George Galloway would say the same thing. He would say, we have hundreds of years of coal. What's your response to them?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, one of them is that look, if Richard Tice, Nigel Farage and all the rest want to say, we're going to nationalise North Sea oil so we keep it ourselves, we can have a separate conversation about that. I mean, P.S., there's a whole question about refining capacity. I mean, it's all very well getting the raw stuff out of the ground. Where is the capacity to refine it? This is one of the things it's doing for America, by the way. They have quite a lot of oil and gas and the rest they can get, but they don't have the refining capacity on the oil side in particular. So they're still being hit by these big price surges. They're not as energy independent as Donald Trump would claim as they would like to be. So there's a stack of things you have to do to turn oil you get, for example, out of the North Sea into something we can actually use. And we don't, for instance, have the refining capacity, nor do I see an industrial strategy that would start to build that up, nor do I see the long term, and you are talking decades, decade or so, to make this happen, to open new fields up in the North Sea, to develop the refining capacity, to say we're going to do this not for sale at the global price and the global market, principally for the benefit of BP and Shell or whoever, because that's what will happen. If it's $100 a barrel oil, which is, by the way, in the North Sea, which is an aging and expensive field to get anything into, that's when it starts becoming economically viable. Okay, $100 a barrel, but that means we're going to be paying that, right? If you don't want to do that, you subsidise it, then you have to nationalise and ban exports, for instance, or at least find some way to manage those flows in a fairly direct, state-directed way. Similar thing with the fracking. Fracking is great in the Great Plains, right? It's really good in the Permian Basin where you've got a load of space. A lot of infrastructure is actually already there, so you can just go and stick a new well in. If you've been watching, it's a really good series, even though it's got these sort of shameless plugs for the oil and gas industry, The Landman. On Paramount. It's worth checking out. It's kind of daft, but it kind of gives you some sense of like what the industry is like in a fairly sort of hokey, US primetime drama with added apologetics for the oil industry sort of way. But you can set up a rig pretty quickly and you've got the infrastructure there and off you go. And it's not the cheapest to do this. You're still $50, $60 break even, that sort of thing. So you're still hoping for a reasonably high price before it actually works. It's going to cost even more if you try and do it in this country, which is, never mind the bans, it's also like a lot of the companies wanting to do this, a bit like the economics don't work. So again, if you're prepared to say, okay, we'll just subsidise it, we'll just nationalise it, fine, Nigel Farage, let's have a serious conversation about that if that's what you want to do. But I bet you that's not what you want to do, because we all know very well that Nigel Farage is now spending a lot of time listening to the captains of industry and the very wealthy people around the financial service industry and the rest of it, and that will not be the conversation. Right? So it's a kind of fantasy that they're proffering around a lot of this stuff. The more realistic part, I would have thought, is for them to say something like, hey, we have a really good deal with the US, who are a net fossil fuel exporter and have been for a long period of time. I mean, one of the completely under-discussed transformations of the world economy in the last decade, 15 years now, has been this shale revolution in the US, this enormous movement from the US being the biggest importer of fossil fuels on the planet to being the biggest exporter, right? That's an incredible change in the balance of the world's energy system, right, on the fossil fuel side. The other one, which we're now starting to see, and we can talk about, is what China is doing in renewables. And that's an entirely new energy system that's being built and exported over there. But this is the old one, the fossil fuel one. Massive shift. And if you're Nigel Farage, you just go, we need to have a really good deal with the US because they're going to give us loads of cheap liquefied natural gas, right? We'll get cheaper than everyone else. It's great. So we have to be close. That's a smarter answer. That's better than like go and dig out the North Sea and hope for the best. That's not a serious one. The serious one is align with the US and we're all going to be good. But where's your independence at that point, right? Where's your actual sovereignty at this point? It doesn't exist, because you're tying yourself deeper and deeper to the US, which is exactly what Trump wants, in as much as he thinks about this. They want to use the control of fossil fuel resources around the world. They are doing this. Taiwan had a deal as part of their trade deal with Trump last year to supply LNGs, get first dibs on liquefied natural gas, which Taiwan has a huge demand for and doesn't have much in the way of any local supply. It's part and parcel of how Trump is trying to very deliberately, and the Trump administration is very deliberately, understands that the world is suffering from all sorts of material shortages in various different ways, and he's trying to leverage what the US can do out of that. Farage, Tice, the rest of them will sign up to this like shots. They'll be there straight away.
The 51st state, except we don't get to actually vote on the president. You know, complete defence and energy integration, complete market integration.
That's exactly it.
I would say, I mean, when you were saying that actually if we have a conversation around nationalising oil and gas, okay, that's something else, but they're not doing it. It almost sounds like you'd be up for that.
Oh, you'd be up for it only in the sense that you want to close these things down. Because here's the bigger picture. Let's say we are Britain that wants to have, assuming Britain still hangs together as a unified state, but let's say you're Britain in 20 years' time and you want to have those good relations with the rest of the world. Will you have good relations with the rest of the world by being a country that has taken what was a genuine lead amongst the larger developed countries on reducing its CO2 emissions, and a genuine ability and capacity, a soft power in terms of climate negotiations, which PS is one of the few forms of multilateral negotiations that still functions in the world that we now live in. I mean, the UN's a complete busted flush, but the climate negotiations, even with the US wandering out, is still a serious multilateral institution, driven onwards by China, but a whole load of other developing countries are all signed up to this as well. If you want to actually exercise some sort of diplomatic independence, you need to maintain that lead, and you do not do that. You fundamentally do not do that by saying we're going to open more oil and gas fields in the North Sea, and even worse, even more disastrously, you start saying we're going to dig coal out of the ground, right? Oh, and by the way, I got back far enough. My family were miners, up in Lancashire. This is a miserable, horrible job, by the way. You can tell it's miserable and horrible because people sing songs about dying because you're going to work, right? That's how you know it's miserable and horrible. So you wouldn't want to do that. You want to do it open cast, which is somewhat better, but disgusting environmentally. But at least you're not sending people down a pit to try and do all this stuff. So again, there's sort of degrees of fantasy about what is really being talked about here. But the serious part of it is that if you want Britain to maintain some sort of ability to negotiate and operate in a world where traditional sources of power have shifted and changed, our capacity, our ability to be able to say we are leading on climate change and we are setting the pace for others, and this is an example and we can make negotiations happen, that is actually authority. And when you're losing other forms of authority, you don't want to throw this away. Are
we leading when 90% of solar panels globally are made in China? When 75% plus of lithium-ion batteries are made in China? And that I suppose, is the point. We're effectively substituting, energy dependence from one part of the world onto another. And I will say right now, we could decarbonise the entire grid. We actually do on some days. We could decarbonise the entire grid in 2 years, permanently, if we wanted to. Of course we could. Massive oversupply of wind and solar, and you've still got some nuclear in there. You probably want a little bit more of that. But in terms of industrial energy, if Britain does want to produce things like solar panels and lithium-ion batteries, and it wants to maybe produce some EVs, microprocessors, you want some of these, I presume, it would need cheaper sources of energy. And the thing is, you can't run car plants on solar and wind. You can't.
Hang on, that's not. I mean, part of the reason that
you can't forge steel. You can forge steel with hydrogen, but it's a lot more expensive.
We're getting there. I mean, the technology is advancing on green steel. We're some distance away from being economically viable relative to the steel you're going to produce with coking and the rest of it. But it's certainly advancing on that. We are certainly getting to the point where renewables could be a major part of how you're going to run a car plant. Like, one of the reasons Spain has been attracting so much Chinese investment, another slightly under the radar story over the last few years in the Spanish relative success story of economic growth, is the amount of Chinese investment they're getting, is that big Chinese car manufacturers are keen on Spain being able to say that renewables are such a major part of the mix that they're going to be able to supply.
But we don't have their solar. We don't have their solar.
So we'd have to think differently about what you do, which is going to be wind, it's going to be tidal, it's going to be a mix of different things. In terms of leading on what the transition looks like, well, you've got shipping as a really obvious, difficult to decarbonise, massive important sector of the economy. One of those bits where if you've done the energy systems, it's really difficult to decarbonise ships. You can start to take a lead on here. The International Maritime Organisation is based in London. We have Deloitte's list. We have various institutions which are the legacy of a long history of seafaring in various different ways that accounts for a degree of leverage here. If you're not talking about the manufacture, but you're talking about the installation and the maintenance, this is something else you can start to do in this country. If you're not talking about manufacturing and switching over the lives we lead and the kind of material existence that we have and the expectations around what that is, in other words, we are not always getting up in the morning 5 days a week and commuting to work some vast distance and then coming back again, but we're working from home more and we're reducing working hours. These are ways to set leads that can be attractive in terms of how people live their lives, but are also going to be significantly less environmentally damaging. And you can start to think more creatively about what it might mean to live in that world. And we're going to have to, because a lot of this stuff is also starting to build in resilience. If you don't have people relying on long distance transport so much for their commute, you are building a more resilient economy by default, because you're not having these great big infrastructures that are exposed to extreme weather events of every sort, for example.
I mean, also public transport, right? You saw the Iranian government, I think a week or two into the conflict, maybe it was just a week, they wanted to obviously protect and mitigate any energy crisis domestically. Obviously, they have a ton of energy, but in terms of refined petroleum that they could use, they were just offering, I think, free buses in major cities, which is to say, don't use your cars, and it's going to mean that we've got more energy for a longer period of time. Australia did something similar. And I think, this is a classic example of building resilience into the economy, moving away from the emphasis on private transportation, consumption of private goods. Very, very important. Let's talk about Zack Polanski,
okay.
Because when the electorate hears the Green Party, they generally think of Zack Polanski.
Yes.
What do I mean? True, they did quadruple the number of MPs in the last general election, so there's many people who've contributed to their increasingly impressive success. But when he became the leader of the Greens last autumn, last September, I was there at the conference in Bournemouth. They had, I think, just crossed 60,000 members. Even that was significant growth in the election. People had joined to vote. They still had, obviously, the 4 MPs. They'd never won a by-election before. Fast forward to today, they have more than 225,000 members. They've won a by-election for the first time in their history. They repeatedly have polled in second place nationally. One poll, albeit an Ashcroft poll, which is not necessarily on a par with YouGov or Survation, etc., but it's still a poll. Had them in first narrowly, nationally. That's the first time they've finished first in a national poll. So that's a significant shift in 6 months. And so when people think of Zack Polanski and the Greens going hand in hand, it's for good reason. Do you think that he's a more impressive political leader than Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell? Having seen those two up close, do you think that the ceiling on what he's trying to achieve politically is higher?
Look, they are very different circumstances and very different people. And I think the thing that Zack has been particularly good at, notably good at, is not just comms. Everyone says, he's good at communications, he's good at sort of talking, getting his message across. He's also just got an enthusiasm for it. That he doesn't come from an understandable, let's say that, I can see why people are acting like this, an understandable reticence to deal with the mainstream media and the media in all its many forms, which I think Jeremy Corbyn always had for understandable reasons, I would say, from his point of view. And Zack doesn't have that. And he's happy to bounce from one studio to another and answer questions directly and not be obviously unwilling to talk to whoever's going to ask him about what he's up to, right? And that's quite a significant, in this day and age of a kind of not just 24-hour news, but an extraordinary multiplicity of different outlets and forms in which you might be expected to communicate. That's a major advantage to have that. I think he also, because he comes from a point in the political spectrum, regardless of his own sort of personal journey, he's ended up in the Greens, and he's on that part of the political spectrum which does not come with the specific history of the Labour Party, which is both its institutional history, which is if you're leader of the Labour Party, you arrive with this whacking great Labour Party machine, which we were just talking about, which in theory is this sort of Rolls-Royce institution that's going to help deliver a Labour government. And in practice, when Jeremy Corbyn leader, it's let's just say it wasn't, right? It's kind of, pretty much direct sabotage from significant parts of that machine, all now very well documented, but you could see it at the time, right? That doesn't happen in the Green Party. It's much more sort of open institution. It has, I think they've just tripled the number of full-time policy staff they have, because there's now 3, right? Put it that way. This is not an institution that arrives with that history, and it doesn't arrive from a particular conception of how it would be in government, right? Which means it's wide open to what you might do. And that also means it's wide open politically to where Zack could see the Greens going. Because this, I think, is the third thing. And this isn't really a Jeremy Corbyn problem. I think this is a broader, all of us on the left problem, is that you could see it with Boris Johnson. He just had this keen understanding of where his base was, or at least what he wanted to say his base was, and he'd go and deal with that, right? So he was Boris Johnson. He was going to go and be Brexity Boris in the north of England. He was smashing the red wall, driving a JCB through a big brick wall, all that sort of rubbish, And he was going to do that. And there was a degree to which this was never really that true. We don't have to go over what happened in the 2019 election, but the number of marginal Labour seats out there was always very high, and you just need to knock a few people who are always a bit inclined to the Conservatives in the right direction. Off you go, right? That's it's a brilliant bit of analysis. But James Cagnosorium's, the pollster who originally coined the Red Wall and described this, absolutely, it's a really stunning bit of sort of political science that he did, and it turned out to be completely, unfortunately, correct. So Boris Johnson had that sense of who his base was. And he was unapologetic about it, right? So we can talk about it now. His kind of real base is the Tory party over here somewhere in the Shires, and like it always has been. But hey, that's who he wants to talk to. This problem you have with the left in general is that the left's actual base is, let's be quite direct about this. It's a load of younger people, often in cities, often with a university education, typically insecurely employed and renting, who aren't in trade unions. And the left is a little bit like, ooh, because these aren't really like your horny-handed sons and daughters of toil who are all like long-standing trade unionists and have northern accents and that sort of thing, right? So there's a sort of unhappiness about it. And that, I think, is on the sort of almost a cultural level, something that Zack grasps, that he's going to talk to his base and build out from that. He's not going to try and walk away from his base and go somewhere else, which is always the temptation on the left, because you end up with these weird arguments about, whether you support Brexit and what's happening in the north of England and that sort of thing. You don't get that with Zack in the same way. So he's getting the first hurdle of political leadership right, which is that you get your base and you build from them. Trump does the same thing. Anybody who's good at politics, I think, tends to act in this fashion. In our broadly democratic system, you have your base and you build outwards. And that was something that we never quite got right in Labour, I don't think. There was a bit of a hesitancy about understanding who our base actually were and how you build out from them, and a sort of desire to have a different base somewhere else, and a feeling that it ought to be different people who are voting for us somehow.
But I suppose with Trump, look, you could have that approach, and ultimately you just need to win Florida and one of Wisconsin, Michigan, or 2 of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and you win the Electoral College. What you're saying about Zack Polanski, though, and I think that's undoubtedly true. I agree with you about the base thing, but that's clearly not enough to get an electoral majority. You might even be able to get a numerical majority, but there's no point piling up 30, 40,000 majorities in Hackney and bits of Manchester and even South Wales and Leeds and Liverpool if you're losing Halifax and, trying to think of a good Red Wall seat, Boston. If you're losing those seats by 400 or 500, which that's not the case anymore, but it used to be for Labour, these were marginal seats, that's a fool's errand. And the problem with that base, which I agree with you again, is the case. The problem with that base is that it's very geographically concentrated. Young people tend to leave smaller towns, post-industrial towns, they go to larger cities. I mean, the great example of this, of course, is Greater Manchester. People leave places like Oldham or Bury and they go into the big city. Or they go from towns in the southeast of England, they naturally gravitate to Greater London, or they leave Newport and they go to Bristol. We see this all the time. So from an electoral perspective, that's not a good thing, leaning into your base like that, which is why presumably Corbyn didn't do it.
A couple of things in that, three parts to the answer. The first one is the sort of the fairly immediate, relatively short-term demographic part of it, which is that the fastest growing town in the country is still Colchester, last time I looked, right, in North Essex. And it's fast growing because you've got a bunch of people moving there, a little bit older than like recent graduates, people who want to start a family, and you can't afford to do that in London, right? Basically, yeah.
Younger.
But you can see that. See Colchester, Worthing, you see a few other places. In Hastings.
Peterborough, strangely.
Well, there you go. Right, so you can see this happening, this great spread around London, where this sort of absurd pressure cooker of what is happening in London is just not compatible with the kind of lives people want to lead, right? And why shouldn't they want to lead those lives? So they go elsewhere. So you can see that's happening in this ring around London. You can see how that is, for a while now, been turning these places Labour, like Colchester, Worthing, Hastings, there's a few others, Peterborough, that you can think of where this dynamic is in trade. And that's also where they're going to be open, I would have thought, because it's the same demographic, to switching to green over that period of time, assuming Labour doesn't somehow magically solve the problem of regional development in the space of the next 3 years, which they're not going to. So that's the relatively short-term demographic part of it. The other bit is something perhaps more, I would say fundamental, because it's not going to be solved, right? We're kind of going to be stuck with this, which is there is something about the environmental crisis which is distinctive. And I'm trying to hear on a book, a very good book, came out a couple of years ago by A.J. Singh Chowdhury called The Exhausted of the Earth, where he describes this process, but other people have enlightened on the same kinds of ideas, that if you take some of these green areas in the leafier bits of the country, right, the now of green MPs, Suffolk Coastal, for example, and if you went there last summer, you would go and see a load of dried out fields and rivers full of shit. And that's one part of the environmental crisis. And it's pretty raw. And it's pretty much in your face. And the other side of that environmental crisis is if you then go back to Hackney, you'll find things like olive oil or various other foods, milk, eggs, have soared in costs for various fairly large environmental reasons. Superficial one, relatively, is chocolate. It's gone up massively in price because 60% of the world's cocoa comes from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and they've been absolutely hammered by extreme weather of various different sorts over the last few years. A combination, most likely, of climate change and El Nino. Now, this is two parts of the same problem, that you're looking at two parts of it, and there's a kind of unity that starts to appear in that. It's one of the reasons where I think this business that you get in the press about, how can the Greens possibly hold together a coalition, which is a load of people in Hackney and a load of people in Suffolk Coastal. It's actually, there is a thread that is close to the Greens' politics that can start to make that work. And if you can get to that thread, and it is quite different to sort of traditional lefty socialist sort of thread where you go, hey, everyone's working and we all have kind of the same employer and therefore we all face the same forms of exploitation and we'll all band together and against our employer and ultimately we'll understand the entire system of employment and overthrow it, right? That's the kind of step by step. Your classic somewhat stages theory of how does working class consciousness come about. It's not that, but it's something where the crisis itself is forcing people to understand what resilience might look like. And as a result of that, starting to tie them together. Now, that doesn't have to work in favour of the Greens. Like Reform, for example, have started really picking up on the fact that there's a pretty close correlation between parts of the country that are most susceptible to flooding over the next few years, and Reform votes, because it's often places that coastal towns, for example, or places near rivers, places that used to be economically prosperous, now not so much, right? That's a sort of Reform voting place. And Reform have a line on flooding, which is that we need more money on flood defences, fair enough, and the woke Environment Agency should stop worrying so much about kingfishers or whatever, right? And that's their line. And there's an even more insidious version of this, which was quite brilliant in its own sort of evil genius way, which was to go, why, I think it was Lincolnshire County Council, why are we spending all this money on electric buses when we could be spending money on flood defences, right? Which is directly playing off one form of environmental climate change spending against another, the having to deal with climate change. So it doesn't have to work in the direction of the Greens. But if you can start to think about what does solidaristic, what does collective, what does like things where we're all in this together responses to this start to look like, then you're getting somewhere. Which means one of the key questions we're going to face over the next few years is food. The food system, how it operates, how people can get good quality, affordable food. How do we stop farmers getting absolutely hammered by everything that's happening in the world? How do we stop farmers spiraling off into supporting reform or Rupert Lowe's operation, for example, which you certainly see happening in Europe over the last sort of couple of years or so? These are the questions that we're going to be faced with. This is all quite a long way out of what social democracy has really thought about in this country for a good few decades now.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. Also, on the electric buses thing, I mean, if you're a local authority and you have brought your buses in-house, it's much more predictable to project your costs over 12, 24, 48 months if they're electric, rather than going up and down with diesel prices or with unleaded prices. So they would have saved money as well. But your point still stands. You know, there's been a few realizations for me about this over the last couple of years. So one was I was at NEP a few years ago. I love NEP in Sussex. You know, the home in this country of the rewilding movement, I think. And they just built a lovely new restaurant cafe there. And it's with all the food that they have on the estate. So they have pigs and whatnot that effectively have filled in for what would be wild boars and so on. But they've done it in such a way that it's legal and you can walk around. Okay. They have cattle, they have all kinds of things there. Storks, the first storks born in England were born there. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The first storks born in England, I think in about 600 years were born there. But anyway, an incredible place. And I remember being in the car park and I could see hippies. I could see, you know, Labour voting, middle income sort of Sussex families. And I could see quite posh people with electric 4x4s. These are all, to some extent, middle-class people. You know, it's middle-class coded, certainly. But it did get me thinking, you know, the lady with Botox and like 3 very photogenic children and the 4x4, Qashqai, which is an EV, is just as interested in this stuff. Yes. And you would think that's a very different lifestyle that person has to these, you know, 65-year-old boomers wearing their sandals. But they're both finding this place very appealing and dare I say, enchanting, right? The politics of enchantment is very, very important to all of this, which I think social democracy, European social democracy, arguably never had, but it's certainly lost. It's certainly lost that sense of enchantment in the last 20 to 30 years. That was one recognition for me. Another was being at Foyle's Bookshop in London. And I, you know, I'm saying this, you're welcome to go to Foyle's Bookshop and look for yourselves. There was a whole shelf of basically nature writing.
Yeah.
You know, this genre of writing now, you know, about boar in the forest of Dean, or wolves coming back, or rewilding, or, you know, how you can eat from, you know, nose to tail, or restaurant guys, or whatever. And I'm not suggesting this is in any way the mainstream culture. It's not. It's still a minority culture. It's still a middle class culture, but it's so much bigger than it was 10, 20 years ago. And then there was a third one. This is going to sound stupid. We had a painter in. We're having 2 rooms painted. I'm terrible at DIY. I can do a little bit of electrics. That's about it. But anything to do with dust, I'm an asthmatic. I crumble. So if I had to have a proper job, I'd be an electrician, I suppose. But we had somebody in who's doing the painting.
Yeah.
And lovely young guy. And he's a vegan.
All right.
And this just flies in the face of like the reform worldview. Because on the one hand, of course he's vegan, or it's possibly he's vegan. First of all, because we know that generationally younger people are certainly more inclined to explore meat-reducing diets. We know this. But it just flies in the face of the Richard Tice, Nigel Farage worldview that a young tradesman in their 20s would be a vegan because their girlfriend was, which actually is quite a common thing. And then the chap who owns the company who employs him, you know, likes Novara Media.
Okay.
And they have a sort of emphasis on no, but it's just quite amusing to me that, you know, I'm talking to tradespeople who like Novara. There are guys who go past me in a white van. Obviously, I live in Portsmouth. I always say the flag of Portsmouth should be a white van. Some guys will say, oh, I know you from GB News. I love you. And then there'll be some people who say, oh, I watch Novara on YouTube. I love you. But they're both white van drivers. So basically what I'm trying to say is that your coalition, it's not a social majority, but it's pretty bloody big. And it does seem wildly understated in terms of the national political conversation.
Sure, I'm going to go back to Corbynism and what we got wrong. We never made enough of this. Like the to use the old Marxist term, you know, the classic petty bourgeoisie of the small proprietor who is a absolute pillar of the Tory establishment locally. There's still bits of that, but it doesn't really exist anymore. What you find is exactly as you described. Lots of people, partly because of the labour market we have, it's so sort of insecure that you're not just going to go and find a standard employment contract and that's the job you're going to do. There's loads and loads of bits of how the economy operates where you're just going to be self-employed or a small tradesman of some sort, or have to set up your own business. That's just how it's going to be, right? That's what a lot of people are doing. And they're arriving in that with all sorts of different views formed that don't match the classic pattern of socialisation into the petty bourgeoisie of, 50, 100 years ago, right? Where you've got absolute rock solid, this is the core of the Tory vote in the entire country. That's not there in the same way. And I don't think we ever made enough of that as Corbynism, because you had people who would be small business people who would be supporting Jeremy Corbyn. We never really made enough of that. The Greens are different. This is, he's a certain kind of sort of internet lefty will say this is terrible thing. It's just a petty bourgeois party. The Greens are different. They do come from a milieu that's much closer to that in one way or the other, right? Which is, and you can dismiss it all as hippies and God knows what else if you want. But at this point, there's 4 million odd self-employed people and small business people in this country, right? It's lower than the number of trade unions. But the difference being is that it's growing and it's younger, and trade unions are shrinking, membership is shrinking, and it's older, right? So where's the dynamic here? How is society actually changing in front of us, and how are we going to respond to that? Zack Polanski, in his speech at the Green Conference last year, he did that thing where politicians say, what about this person or that person? And if he'd been a Labour leader, he'd go, and we have to look after, whatever the expression was. It was better written than this. It was, we'll be looking out for, if you're a Labour leader, you said, we're looking out for the nurse and the teacher, right? Both solid, typically unionised public sector employees, right? Classic Labour voting, right? That's your unionised public sector employees. And Zack goes, well, what about the plumber, which is prescient, as it turns out, the plumber and the hairdresser, right, which is your classic small business, right, self-employed, typically. And it's complete contrast with what you said was a Labour person. That is where the Greens sort of sit themselves. Hannah the plumber, who was getting some stick for not being in a union, but she's a 35, mid-30s woman working in a sort of blue-collar industry, self-employed or in a smaller employer, right? What are the chances to be in a union with those particular characteristics? It's vanishing point small, right? There's almost no one like her in a union. They say you shouldn't be, or people should be in a union. But typically, people like Hannah who match that set of characteristics are not. And we ought to have a left that can adapt to that rather than sort of saying, well, they should be. They should be. Well, they're not. So what are you going to do? So that's part of your coalition is going to look a bit like this. The broader bit is exactly as you say, that sort of, enchantment's a nice word for it, but it's giving people a kind of pattern of what the world could look like and how it might be better. And I think one of the other traps we got into is that too often the answer on the left is a bit like what the world will look like is like how it was in about 1985, where stuff was still nationalised and there was big unions, or 1975 or 1965. And it's like, that's all great, but that's not actually fitting in the world today. It doesn't matter if Reform do this. Reform can use nostalgia, and they do quite happily. It's a problem for the left to do it because we end up defining ourselves by the nostalgia. It ought to be this. We ought to act as if this thing can come about rather than dealing with the actual society we live in today, where union membership is still falling. And union members are older than the average age of the rest of the country. And they are confined to the public sector. That's the world we actually live in. It might be better if that wasn't the case, but it is the case. And we should be thinking about how we win in the world we live in, not how we win in a world we want to live in, because we want to live somewhere after we won, right? So you start from where you are. So what does your coalition look like? Now, I think you can start to assemble a broad political, if not a majority, a very big plurality that starts to look like what you've talked about the concern for nature, about a different kind of life, about something that builds out of what everybody wants. And you can make that sound popular. And I think Zack does some of that, but that's a kind of a green-inflected politics. The broader question that we're all going to be faced with in 3 years' time is how does that fit into an electoral system which is, it's no longer pretty binary because it's now a 5-party system designed for 2 parties, so it's going to be all over the place. But what do the coalitions look like? Because I don't think the Greens are going to win a majority next time, right? I don't think that's on the plausible set of outcomes. It is on the set of outcomes, it's just not very plausible. I also don't think Reform are going to win a majority, and it will be a different kind of coalition they want to form. So the question of coalition building And the question, therefore, of prioritisation of what your top things you want to think about and talk about and address people and how you go into a coalition negotiation. In other words, the basic political task of what is your programme, what are your top 10 things you're actually going to do is something we're going to have to address. Third and final criticism of Labour when I was working for them, not so much in 2017, but by 2019 it became chronic. What were the priorities? What were the priorities of Corbynism in 2019? Just round.
Well, your ex-boss was central to that, right? Just bolting things on like Waspy Women's, the Manifesto after it had been published, etc.
It was a symptom of a political sort of disorganisation, right, and decay. That you're having to jam everything in just to try and give something to everybody in the hope it will sort of work, because this is the only trick you've got left is sort of big policy announcements, which we could do, and it doesn't actually turn into. I mean, compare and contrast with the Conservatives' manifesto, which is like top 6 things, and it's about 10 pages total. Didn't actually deliver, as I recall, those top 6 things, but, it was very clear what they were going to do. Number 1, Brexit. Number 2, more police. Boom, boom, boom. You could recite it. We need something like that. The people who've got closest to it in a coalition form was the New Popular Front in France in summer 2024, which was led by France Insoumise, the radical left, and dragged in the old Social Democrats and the Greens and everybody else. Not so much dragging the Greens, a more friendly relationship. But it's a really clear document. It's worth digging it out, and you can run it through Google Translate if you like, because it has what they call the rupture. Top 10 things we're going to do, right? Which is all sorts of good environmental things, by the way, and then a big plan for what happens after the first year or 2 years or so, So you've got both parts of it. You've got the longer term vision. These are the things here. That is probably, in my head, what kind of ideal lefty sort of manifesto is going to look like. Some structure like that would be what you want to get to the next election with.
How big a breakthrough do you think Hannah Spencer was as a candidate for the Greens? Because you're talking about the petty bourgeois, and it's something that I observed for the very small amount of time that I spent with her, was that she seemed to me like a candidate that represents family capital against global capital. Yeah. And it's something I've tried to say to right-wingers, and they just don't believe me, and then she wins a majority of 4,500. But she was very much trying to listen to what small businesses wanted, their concerns, antisocial behaviour, how public service provision could help them, from refuse collection to street cleanliness, etc., 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 which aren't necessarily things that people associate with the Green Party, unfairly or fairly, certainly not associated with it by the right. But it does feel like she offered something of a template in terms of that coalition that you'd build, right?
Yeah. And this isn't, by the way, this isn't alien to the left. I mean, you're going back a bit, and it's the other side of Manchester. But Oldham in the 1840s would elect radical MPs because the radicals knew how to talk to the local shopkeepers and petty bourgeoisie, because they're the only people who get the vote, right? You've got 10% franchise. It's slightly bigger in Oldham because of the weird way the system worked, but these are the people you had to talk to. Now, the way you actually talked to that was, because it was an open ballot, you could threaten not to shop at places who weren't voting the right way. No, so it's a bit of an antagonistic relationship. But we are not, if we are prepared to take a long historical run of what the left and socialism and the socialist movement, the labour movement looks like in this country, it is not alien to us to think about how you win over the petty bourgeoisie, right? Even in the environs of Manchester. So it's really good that Hannah's doing that, and I think it's a key part of why she won. I mean, look, I have to say, there is a sort of, this is the worst possible case version of what happened in Gorton and Denton, is that we had a brilliant candidate. We had this sort of perfect moment with the Andy Burnham not standing as the Labour candidate, which was really challenging. You still had Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. This is sort of stacking up things that are going to make this work in a particular way. And then the Reform candidate, I think, was just not somebody who's going to ever fly.
Matt Goodwin.
Yeah, Matt
He
Goodwin.
looks like a home counties estate agent
He wasn't,
in Greater Manchester.
So this is almost the best possible set of circumstances to deliver what was a thumping result. And it's a really, really important result. And it's a credit to people who campaigned, a credit in particular to Hannah for being that brilliant candidate. But it's the really good result. The bit that we should be wary of is Reform still got what percentage in the end with this candidate who is not ideal, let's say, right? And running a campaign which you hardly saw him. It was all online. And yet somehow they delivered, well, I'm going to say 30% can't be that high. But it was a big old chunk of the vote in Gorton and Denton. Now, if you thought what Reform were doing then is a bit of a trial run for what a general election campaign looks like, they can't mobilise, but can they run an online-only campaign in every single constituency in the country? Yes, they can. And even in one that is not on the Reform target list, it is way down. Gorton and Denton was not ever really a Reform target. No, right? And they still got a big old vote. So that ought to be a little like alarm bell being clanged at this point, is that yes, we can defeat. It is possible to get a thumping big vote with 2,000 people and more on the ground knocking doors. An outstandingly good candidate, the perfect wider political circumstances, because Labour have just done the worst thing for themselves.
Yeah.
And yet there's still this big old reform vote, right? And we're going to have a bit of a shock. I have a horrible feeling that we'll end up with a bit of a shock, perhaps especially in London, when reform are going to do better than people anticipate in this city in particular.
We'll talk about the locals in a minute, because I think you're right. Reform's polling has sort of ebbed down this year. They've clearly lost some of that momentum that they'd gained over the previous 18 months. And maybe that was inevitable because they'd had such an amazing 18 months, the best 18 months of maybe any political party since Tony Blair, actually. So maybe that was inevitable. But regardless, we're clearly going to see Reform do very well at these elections in May. And I do think that's going to be something, a wake-up call. We did a conversation with Ash and I. It was a Downstream Live. We put it up on our YouTube channel. And it was about, how do we beat the right? Mm-hmm. And I saw one of the comments after the by-election saying, this must have been before the by-election because we've beaten the right. And I'm thinking, that's a little bit presumptuous. We haven't beaten the right. They're probably about to pick up 2,000 councillors in May. But before we talk about that, do you think the Greens are failing at being a wider social movement? So you talked about this huge membership, 200,000 people. One thing I notice a lot, I always pick up litter. I love picking up litter. And if
you fit right in the Greens, Aaron.
Oh, I know. Well, this is my question. I love picking it up, and it's very easy to do, and it makes me feel morally superior, and it's good for wildlife. And I try to teach the habit to my daughter. My wife says, "No, don't let her pick up rubbish with her hands." And I say, "It's just a crisp packet. It's fine. It's good." We're instilling something important in her. But I wonder, you've got all these members. You've got, for instance, Young Greens. Why isn't the Green Party saying, let's have every Saturday hundreds of young members going to this or that city? We can do it by region. We can have 4 clusters of them nationally in England and Wales. And they can go there and they can do a massive litter pick and they can make loads of social first content. And nobody is going to hate on that. Nobody is going to hate on that, by the way. And in a marketing sense, they talk about jab, jab, hook, right? So with marketing, it's just a little something, and then I'm asking for your money. Now, I'm not suggesting the Greens should be that transactional, but in terms of winning votes, that's actually often how it works. I've done some casework for you as a councillor. Please vote for our candidate in the general election. And it does feel like that huge resource of their membership right now isn't being deployed as it could be. Now, I know there are lots of demands on their time. They want to pick up at least a couple of hundred councillors in these local elections. They're doing extraordinarily well in so many things. But it does feel like they're neglecting that social movement part of them, which they could be doing I
think a lot of that is happening on a local basis, so you wouldn't see, which is probably where it should be happening. So I know that in my
But isn't that a failure of national politics?
No, I think it's if you want to say it's a failure of national politics, you could say it's a failure of national politics, not just the Green Party. This is a broader failure. Right?
A failure of communication in the context of national politics.
But this sort of stuff works best when it's local, right? This is you're getting into the nitty gritty of what people are going to vote for and how you build a movement and what you need to look like you're doing. I know that my local party out in Tower Hamlets is regularly off picking up litter. They were clearing out Tower Hamlets Cemetery Park like 2 weekends ago. This sort of thing, right? It does happen. It does get publicised. It is chugging along. Other local parties doing the same thing. This is very close to like what, sort of baseline of what a bunch of Greens want to do, and rightly actually, because I think it's, again, underrated by the sort of conventional left that doing this sort of stuff is actually appealing to people. It's a similar thing, it's a tangent, but Zora Mamdani, popping up and just being a bit cheerful. It's like, do you know what? People kind of like seeing someone happy, and they'll want to vote for this person. They feel like this happy person might change things rather than like you're going to turn up and look like, just sour face and miserable and is everything terrible the whole time. Mamdani talks about things being bad and here's how it could be better. Big happy smile, off you go and vote for him. Like, that's a good thing to think about. And it's a good thing to think about what can you do that's sort of small scale, that's picking up litter, that's clearing up a park, whatever it might be, that's actually going to start to build that social connection. This is not a traditional socialist labour movement thing of going, I will go to my local trade union branch. You can do that as well. But it's the bits that people will see in the kind of, alienated might be the word, but certainly sort of where the big social institutions are broken down in lots of different ways, to do something visible that's there in your community, that's visibly there and obviously like just a good thing to be doing, is an important part of it. But it's happening locally rather than nationally.
And again, very much in line with the historical traditions of green politics and the ideology of green politics, which is direct action, right?
Yeah.
If, your local park has a load of rubbish in it, go pick it up.
Yes.
Rather than lobbying powerful people to do it. Obviously, you should do both if you're trying to be a political party as well. Before we talk about the May local elections, quickly, because I still want to talk about a lot with you, James. How many MPs do you think the Greens can win at the next general election?
Oh, God, I think I may have told, this is going back a bit, I think I told some journalists, oh, why not 100? And they laughed or whatever. And that doesn't feel too...
When was
wise.
this? When
that
they
was
laughed?
going, this is before Christmas Eve.
Okay, before the by-election. They're not, as Nigel Farage would say, they're not laughing now.
Doesn't count after the by-election, because at that point it seems a lot more serious. And that's what I said then, and that feels like a sort of number you could think about. But there is and up from that point. I mean, one thing that Zack is good at communicating is a kind of confidence, right, which does help. It's like when he says, we should replace Labour. It's like you do kind of have to speak this in order to try and make it happen, right? And there is a version of the world where that in fact happens. We're still some way from it, and people shouldn't get carried away because whatever the Greens membership is now, and it can't be that far off Labour's by this point, particularly an actual functioning membership, like who's getting out and actually doing things, never mind just paying your dues.
I suspect it might be bigger.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, on the who's actually doing things.
No,
so
I think
sure.
even if, because they don't actually get rid of the members until 6 months after the final payment's made. The Greens are now over 225. I think Labour's 260. I think it's certainly going to happen in the next month or two, unless something strange happens, right?
But there's still this enormous weight of decades, century of Labour voting. Some parts of the country had a Labour MP for more than a century by this point, haven't they? Wigan would be one of them. I would have thought back to at least 1918. And that's a lot of history and weight of expectations and beliefs. And a lot of it is very sensible beliefs that, broadly speaking, if you're working class, it makes sense to vote Labour because they're going to be better than the other lot and they'll do a few things. And it's not necessarily going to completely transform your entire world, but that isn't necessarily what you're going to want to vote for anyway. So here you are. This is a good, solid, sensible, good sense in the Gramscian way to think about it. That's kind of changing now because Labour no longer has that immediate good sense to vote Labour. It will do the things that are necessary. And the Greens are starting to get some of that, but it's a long way from actual replacement. But I think there's a serious case to be made that the Green approach to thinking about what seats are winnable needs to be significantly broader than it has been in the past. And I don't think that's doubted by anybody in the party at this point in time after the Gorton and Denton by-election.
Do you think there's going to be a problem with personnel? Because if you look at the SNP, for instance, they won loads of MPs in 2015. Or you look at Reform, they're winning loads of councillors. And what happens is that the quality of those people is just generally not as high as what it was before, which is kind of inevitable, right? And you're not obviously going to completely sort that out. But it does feel if the Greens went from 5 MPs, they might win another by-election before the next general election, but 5 MPs to, let's say, 80 MPs.
Yeah.
Are you not worried that you get basically some chancers and weirdos and sycophants and people who just aren't very good? I suppose if you look at, for instance, some of the Labour MPs that won in 2017, Jared Amara, for instance, they weren't necessarily the best equipped for the job. Is that a concern, the personnel?
There's a strength here in having a very decentralised approach to basically absolutely everything, which is that local parties can get to decide who their MP candidate is, right? And that is a pretty solid barrier against failures of imposition. Or what happened in 2024, it turns out you had Peter Mandelson going through a spreadsheet of potential candidates. It's an incredible thing to be doing. But this is what was happening at the time, where you have this weird, pretty incomprehensible, centralised, semi-centralised process of various different factions and fiefdoms all deciding who gets to be the Labour candidate, particularly in winnable seats. That's not going to happen in the Greens. And I think there's an automatic control in who's going to make their way through that sort of process because it is so from the ground up. Now, that doesn't mean that this or that local party isn't going to elect or select someone pretty wild as their candidate, but you're going to have to take a mix of different options, I think, in the range of people who want to stand at that point. The hard part for the Greens is something that we're starting to see, which is that it's just going from what do you think about if you are a kind of protest party, a party thinking about the long term. I think a lot of the long-standing Greens would see their version of political change is quite a long process, right? That we're here to represent something and down the line we'll have a really fundamental change to how society operates. And this is a process over decades, right? So it's different to the usual electoral shove and bickering and everybody, jostling for position and we're going to be in government soon. But we are now jostling for position and we could be in government soon. And that's a snap of how you have to think about what you're doing next. That's quite challenging for everybody because I don't know if we necessarily had that same, for those people who've kind of migrated from Labour over to the Greens in the last few months, and it may even be the majority of the Green membership by this point, which is a bit of a weird thing, but it can't be far off. We didn't necessarily have that process of deep thinking inside Corbynism. right? We didn't really go through because it was such a rush to go from 2015, he's elected. He gets to the 2016 leadership challenge. And then suddenly you have this snap election in 2017 and a great rush to like just present something and see if it works. And it kind of does. And then the post-2017 bit is like waiting around for the next election so you can kind of walk into Downing Street, which was kind of misplaced confidence. But that was one part of the problem that we're facing. It is not seriously thinking about what are your priorities, how are you going to make different bits of the government work, what are you going to say to people, who are you going to negotiate in a coalition when that turns up, which is an immediate pressing question for the Greens. Or even if you're not going to be in a coalition, what are you going to do about confidence and supply? What are you going to do to decide to keep well out of all of this? You know, these are hard, very crunchy political decisions that have to be made that come attached to what does a policy and a programme look like? What is your base of support? Who are the next people you're going to vote for you? And that is also a tough challenge, I think, for the Greens at this point. Who are the next sets of Green voters? You know, if you take the old More in Common, six-way division of the great British public, and I can never remember their names properly, but the progressive activists, which is not a great name, but basically it's you and me, Aaron, and it's probably almost everyone watching Novara, and it's basically like almost all of them are now voting Green. You've stitched up almost every progressive activist in the entire country, they're all off voting Green. That's great, but it's like 12% of the electorate, whatever it is. Who's next? And looking at using, for all its flaws, that More in Common division, there are two sets of people who are likely to be voting Green next. One of them is that bunch of people that I think they call the established liberals. And, you know, it's a kind of somewhat better off, more middle class, long-standing Labour voters, like public services, want to see nice people in charge delivering things. Yeah, you can kind of imagine, you know, these are the people that are going to be
very
sitting
Remainy.
Yeah, pretty Remainy. And the other set is, I forget what the More in Common division was, but it's the angry people. It's the people who want to kick the fucking table over. And you meet these people, and if you were out canvassing, you'd have met them as well. And it's like, I'm either Reform or Green or undecided. Right now, if these are your two next sets of people who you need to find a way to get to vote for you, that's quite a political and policy challenge, a programmatic challenge, because how are you going to get all this to line up? Right, that's not necessarily easy, because one lot is like, steady she goes, Britain's all right, really, it's all going to be fine. And the other lot are kick the table over, show the bastards in charge what for. Yeah. And they will vote for whoever is most likely to do that. Now, I think Zack Polanski and the Greens clearly got a good story in this one. And for as long as people are going to think, yes, that set of people, I think we can win. But how do you square with that? That's a sort of challenge that maybe a policy-focused think tank might want to.
We'll talk about them, actually. We'll talk about Verdant, your policy-focused, green-aligned think tank in a second, as well as the local elections. I remember just ahead of the 2017 general election, maybe in the first week, I was invited to sit in on a focus group. Yeah. I've probably told you this. Sit on a focus group right at the start of the general election. And I think that's when I thought, oh, actually, Labour might be onto something here. I think maybe it was 2 weeks in, because Labour had begun to get and generate a little bit of momentum with the leaked manifesto. And you've got your focus group. Some people voting Labour, some Tory, some care about Brexit, some don't. It wasn't like 2019. It didn't become the Brexit election like people thought it would. But there was one woman in the corner. She just wouldn't shut up about, and I mean this in a good way. I'm not criticising her. I would have done the same thing if I was in that focus group. She wouldn't shut up about income inequality.
Yep.
She wouldn't shut up about how the rich are fleecing everybody else. We have to get them out. We have to address this situation. And I remember thinking, 3 years ago, this person, the person who's just angry at everybody, would have been angry about how we need to leave the European Union.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
We need a referendum. David Cameron, give us a referendum. But all of a sudden, everybody else was kind of like placated one way or another. They cared about something one way or another. But the person who was maybe 40% of the whole conversation was this lady who was desperate to intervene and insert some class politics and some redistributive politics into it. We didn't see that in 2019. But I think that's right. Bridging the establishment liberals, the progressive activists, and the angry people, which, by the way, there's lots of them, these green reform floating voters.
There's a whole stack of them out there.
And you just don't see that in the national political conversation, but you meet them and they want to give the establishment a bloody nose. And if they like the local candidate, like...
And they're right to.
Like Hannah
This is
the
something worth pointing out, that like, if you want to give the establishment a bloody nose, and you think there is too much wealth inequality in Britain, and you think the system is rigged against people like you and everyone you know, you are in fact right. And it is worth saying that.
So Verdant, what is it, James? Is this... about providing the policy platform for a green government? What are the ambitions?
Well, look, the Green Party in particular is its own internal, very democratic to a fault processes for deciding what policy is and how things are organised, and that's not something that Verdant or anybody else can or should or would want to interfere with. So that's there. But I think what you can do if you have a think tank, and I should say it's like we keep saying green aligned, but we'll talk to anyone and work with anyone within reason. This is serious because if you also think, well, we're going to have a coalition government, then we probably ought to start now, dealing with what that might involve and what sort of common ground people have and how you're going to have those conversations over the next 3 years or so. What's that going to start to look like? So it's worth thinking early on about what to do there. And because you're already thinking like that, there are elements of what a programme might look like that some people in Labour would agree with. You'd hope the Greens would agree with. There'll be people implied who'd agree with parts of this. You can start to see what that, call it a common programme or something, starts to emerge and starts to look like. So I think that's part of what you'd want to do over the 3 years, is help inform those sets of discussions. That's the outside of the Greens part of it. The more closer to where the Greens are, I think, is it's difficult because I worked in party politics. I was John McDonnell's economic advisor for a while, up until 2018. It's very difficult to get out of the day-to-day. John made strenuous efforts to do this, I think, more so than other frontbench politicians would have done. But partly that was a reflection of the fact there was no think tanks nearby to do this sort of thing, right? NEF had sort of disappeared at that point. They were doing their own thing, wandered off the reservation rather. They were out doing their own thing. IPPR weren't there. We didn't have those institutions that as they develop to the places where you can do a bit of the longer term thinking. And I wouldn't call it thinking dangerous thoughts, but it's thinking thoughts outside of what you can say as a political party or a political leader right now, right? You can say things that Zack Polanski can't talk about. So if you want to have an extended conversation about basic income or something, as a think tank, off you go, because that's what you're going to do. And that's not like Zack Polanski doing this, because Zack Polanski does it. It's like Green Party policies, this, and there's a layer of detail that everyone asks for and specifics, and it's a whole conversation. It just changes everything. Whereas if you're over here in a think tank, you can do something different, and you can come with ideas, and anybody wants them gets them. Look, if Labour turn around and say, give us all your best ideas, fine. That's absolutely fine by me. I will talk to anyone literally on this. I just don't think that's going to happen. But you have that space to think a bit longer term, to think about what is the shape of the next election going to be and what arguments and discussions do we want to be having running into it? For instance, what kind of number do we want to think about the next government will need to spend to, as a minimum, get public services back to what they were in 2010? Because that's quite a big number.
A lot of money.
Yeah, it's a big number. It's actually between you and me, probably smaller than it was in 2024 because Labour's actually spent a bit more.
Well, it's not between you and me, James. It's with our audience now.
But it's true. They have increased spending. And it's not delivered because this is then the next part of it, which is, okay, how do we have a conversation about public services, which is how do we make these things better that isn't just give them a load more money, right? Or, as an alternative, privatise them because they're all just rubbish anyway. The person who's made a real lead in this, him again, is Zoran Mamdani, who our first report from Verdant is basically an account of how to save money if you're a progressive government. So, how do you drive out the profiteering, the various rip-offs, the outright fraud in some cases, the defence procurement failures? What do you do to make that happen? What are the steps you can take? How much money does that come to? And it's an extraordinarily large amount. Just from totting up what the National Audit Office says, plausibly you get to about £30 billion a year, which is just kind of waste. It's stuff where government fails and you can start to claw some of that money back. And that's a pretty conservative estimate on our side. These are the sort of conversations you need to have, right? Because you want, I would have thought, at least some of that 30 billion to be in play as how the Greens can plausibly say, or anybody else can plausibly say, this is money we're going to spend in public services instead. But that's not the same as just spend a load more money, right? You're getting into how does the state operate? How do you make it work better questions? That's why it's there as our first thing to talk about.
The whole point about saving money I find fascinating because, one of the memes about Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is that, it's corrupt. Of course, I'm sure there's some corruption. It's corrupt and all the money is wasted by the government. And then you look at defence spending. Their defence spending is very low. It should be said that the defence spending of the Sepah and the Revolutionary Guard are separated, so it's not as low as it may look. It's still very low. And they've obviously been able to develop indigenous supply chains for ballistic missiles, all kinds of technology, which has been pretty impressive. And then you look at Britain, which apparently we have no corruption. We just call it outsourcing and privatization in this country. We have no corruption, and we spend 60 billion and we don't have aircraft carriers that work. And you do sort of think to yourself, well, which country is more corrupt when it comes to military spending? I mean, the outcome should probably suggest the answer there. So I think there is absolutely a lot of waste, and I think that's something that the left has sort of failed to has failed to address, and it's allowed the right to grab the language and own the language of efficiency, which is terrifying because everybody wants efficiency, right? And that's actually a cool thing I've talked about one regime and state a long way away, Iran. Another one, the Mao Zedong, China.
God, reeling out all the hits here.
The greatest hits. But it's really fascinating where there's a great book where it talks about the sort of the big business leaders in China at BYD, at Huawei, and the impact of the Cultural Revolution on lots of these people. Cultural Revolution was terrible, had lots of bad aspects to it. But they say, well, we learned some lessons from the last 40 years of Chinese history. One of them is efficiency.
Yes.
Don't waste money. Waste is capitalist. Not wasting is communist. And I thought, wow, that's the complete opposite of the left tradition in Europe and America. We say, oh no, waste. If you care about waste, you're a Thatcherite, you're a Reaganite. You talk about waste, that means you're anti-state. In China, the tradition is completely opposite. It means you're pro-state. And it does feel like it's something that, we shouldn't just be giving up so easily.
Pro-state and also pro-competition in a way that we don't really get in like the capitalist West rather than the capitalist China, but that's a whole separate conversation for us to have. But it's pro-competition. The Chinese innovation system is really fascinating, the way that the state helps encourage and enforce forms of competition. That if you take this country, and you get even the same in the US, where you have like, this is, I don't think the language of national champions quite gets used anymore, but it's a sort of, here is our moat. We want to absolutely dominate. Peter Thiel talks about this. Competition is for losers. You get rid of all competition. And then you're going to be really innovative and you're going to stay at the top and build a moat around what you're doing, right? No one can invade. And that's your model for a successful tech firm. The Chinese innovation ecosystem does not work like that. It is a whole load of smaller companies all competing ferociously with some degree of state support and some degree, quite a significant amount of state support and encouragement for this process. And it's a very different way of operating to what we've ended up with as major parts of our innovation system, where it's like pick one thing and chuck everything at it, right? It's quite, and it's working better, I would have thought by this point, in some key industries, clearly working better. Chinese EVs are ahead of what you can get from Western manufacturers as of this point in time, right? Very noticeably so. They're cheaper and they have more things that the car does, and they just, we get these reports from like auto traders send over their people to the Shanghai Motor Show and they come back saying, I've seen the future and it works, or equivalents of that. That system is working, but it's got that element of competition in there, which is completely the opposite for the sort of the cliche version of what the Chinese economy is operating like.
Yeah, this is so important. So I think any business in China which has more than 9 employees has a party cell. You've had very, huge amounts of state backing for EVs, lithium-ion, solar panels, all these breakthrough technologies where they're just owning global market share. But at the same time, so you have all these things which are very statist. Nigel Farage would hate it. But as you've said, they have a much more competitive domestic market. So BYD has actually been seeing in China their profit margins being squeezed because the market is so competitive. Geely and Xiaomi are producing very impressive cars, but because it's so competitive, it means their product is now very, very cheap, and they can actually now seize increasing parts of global market share. This is how capitalism is meant to work.
Yes.
And yet, it's being led by China, not the capitalist West, which is, we can park that. It's a conversation for another day. But it does show that, our presumptions around industrial policy and production actually have been very wrong over the last 40 years. On Verdant, who else is involved? Where has it come from?
At the minute, it's me and Deborah Don't, who is a long-standing, somebody else, both of us were once upon a time working at the New Economics Foundation, but a different period.
You were the chief economist there, right?
I was. And Deborah, I forget what she was doing. It's before my time, so that's going to be my excuse. Who's someone who comes from a more sort of development background and has worked across the sort of NGO sector in different roles. And both of us, it turned out, had separate conversations with a mutual friend who realised that we both said, hey, we need a think tank or something similar. This is a big moment with the Zack Polanski surge. This is changing the parameters of British politics, English politics at least. And there's this chance of a genuinely transformational government in about 3 years' time. And as part of making that happen, we definitely need some space where the sort of bricks and mortar or the nuts and bolts of like what you do when you're in government and how you build up support for a programme is worked out and developed. And we both had this conversation and got brought together by a mutual friend. The reaction has been really, really impressively good. I think there's a point where the launch, I felt, I was very pleased at how the launch went in the sense it got some good coverage. There was a bunch of people, including various Green MPs, including Hannah Spencer, turned up to the actual launch event. It felt like this could be a good part of the ecosystem that we all need. And again, it's a cross-party basis that if we think about what the next election is going to look like, I personally can't look at myself and I won't be able to talk to Leo, who is now 2, in 5 years or 10 years' time and say, what did you actually do to stop Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister? Like, what did you actually do between now and then, given these two options? There is a sort of secret third option, which is the Labour-Tory coalition. But given these two basic options for how the next government is going to look, if you are not working to make sure it is the government that's going to deliver the good stuff for most people in this country, and it is not a Nigel Farage-led coalition government, if you're not spending your time trying to make sure it's one and not the other, what on earth are you doing? And I want to have a decent answer to that, so that's why I'm involved.
I want to talk about immigration.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be the issue where, Reform are going to pick up lots of votes and where potentially the Greens are viewed by Reform anyway as vulnerable. Has immigration been too high in the last 5 years, 6 years?
Oh, that's a wild question to chuck in there. I mean, look, we've had immigration in the last few years that reflects the kind of capitalism that we have in this country, right? So you kind of, and it's pretty crude, you sort of turn off one bunch of people turning up to do a bunch of jobs that British capitalism demands, which is typically sort of insecure and poorly paid and the rest of it. Not particularly, that's not immigrants driving down wages. This is the structure of capitalism has these demands and these are the people who filled those particular jobs. You turn that bit off and then you still have those demands, so there's another different surge of people coming to the country. The problem there is what kind of economy do you have, not like what should be the number on up or down. So I don't think that's quite the right way to phrase it. The interesting one with immigration is that this might be part of the Reform story because I do feel like they peaked in terms of support and they're sort of, doesn't mean they won't have another upsurge at some point. But look, the figures in immigration are telling their own story at this point in time. It's falling. And that means that Reform are losing their big story that they could talk about, the Boris wave and all the rest of it, right? That's not really there for them, which is part of their problem. They're thrashing around a bit and they're running out of an easy option to go for, which is some relatively simple things. I mean, simple but unpleasant things you can say about immigration. And instead they're being pushed by their right in the form of Rupert Lowe's new party, Restore, into just having to be much more aggressively unpleasant, like much more obviously and openly, nakedly sort of nativist, which is where Restore have got themselves to. And they're facing that pressure in part because they've lost the big or are losing the big easy argument about immigration and getting dragged somewhere else. I mean, I thought the indefinite leave to remain was particularly obnoxious. And the thing that Zia Youssef put out, which is like, we're just going to get rid of people and we'll have like a British ICE to do it. It's just an appalling sort of thing to do. Which
it's not worked in the United States. I'm curious how it's going to work here.
Well, this is one. I think this is sort of the brain rot where you just point at America and say, do that here, and it's all going to magically work. And two, I just don't think it's actually done that many favours. I think it's overstepped the mark for a bunch of their own supporters in various different ways. There's a lot of people, we discussed this, there's a lot of people voting Reform because they're kind of angry. And it's like what form that anger takes and where it gets directed is a conversation to have with these people. And it's not obvious that it would be like, yeah, do you know what? There's like 100,000 more than that. People are quite settled here with their families, so we're going to deport them. That's just the thing we're going to do. How do you feel about that? A load of people will be like, not particularly keen. You can see it in the polling. So this sort of pressure on their right is not necessarily helping them. The bit that I want to make sure is underlined here is that this is not good. There's a sort of complacency. We go, well, in that case, they'll just wander off and become more right-wing and nobody will vote for them. It's like, or they change the kind of conversations we're having, which is something that's certainly starting to happen, I think, which is really where this gets very unpleasant. That if you end up with somehow there's an elected MP saying, actually, who's not even elected, it was Matt Corbyn, wasn't it? Oh, you're not really British if X, Y, and Z.
I think he said English, right?
Excuse me, yes. That's kind of, this isn't great either way. And it's like, this is not a good place for us all to be getting to. And the role of Restore in shaping what a particular conversation plays out as, not just Restore, beyond Restore, into Tommy Robinson land, and beyond that Elon Musk, It's like, this is alarming. It was brilliant just a weekend or so ago to see so many people out for the anti-far right march. That, just to have that response to the Unite the Kingdom rally of 500, however money they ended up claiming for it, and there were some wild figures on the rounds, but it was
4
big.
million, if you ask,
Yeah, well,
Katie
we're
Hopkins.
not going to ask them, but it was lots, right? It was big, and it should have alarmed everyone who didn't want to live in a country where this was suddenly the people making the running and parts of the national conversation were in fact Tommy Robinson, who is otherwise for a decade and more being a marginal figure, and rightly a marginal figure. He's suddenly at the head of this and starting to set the terms of who gets to be English and who doesn't on Tommy Robinson terms. Right? That is a very, very bad place for us to get to. So to have the response, which is a big, visible, here is a presence on the streets, is a very, very good thing. And it's a necessary part, I think, of that political fight.
Is there a part of your answer there, though? You're saying the issue, and I think this is going to happen, because immigration falls, the issue is going to become less salient, which could benefit the Greens. I think that's true. And it's certainly going to make the attacks on the Greens less vicious. It's very hard to say, you're going to open the borders when you say, well, hold on, net migration is the lowest it's been in 25 years or whatever, where we could be there by 2029. So, I mean, isn't that in a way politically irresponsible? Because you're benefiting, and I think that will happen, you're benefiting from reforms that Labour will be introducing, which you're attacking. So Labour will be lowering the salience of immigration by implementing policies that Greens disagree with.
The other bit here is the bit that really determines immigration is the state of the economy. Right? If this thing is growing because of the economy we have, this is a particular demand for particular kinds of labour in particular places, which has been met by migration in various ways for a long period of time, for 20 odd years now. That's what's happened. That's the structure of the economy that we have. If the economy isn't growing and the economy is not growing, that demand disappears. So the issue isn't so much that Labour is putting these reforms and aren't they working marvellously well. It's like the Labour government is not actually delivering the economic growth it said it would, and so no one wants to come here, because why would you?
I don't know. I mean, if I look at the last Tory government towards the end and then Labour now, clearly they're contributing towards low immigration. But we can put a pin in that. I do just think that basically this will become less salient because Labour will do a bunch of things that Zack Polanski will publicly criticise, but then will electorally benefit from. And I think it's probably important to be honest about that. When I saw the by-election in Gorton and Denton, Hannah Spencer wasn't really talking about immigration. She didn't need to, because like you say, there was this tidal wave of things in her favour, which was good candidate, local, bad reform candidate. Labour didn't pick, Burnham. But, in a tighter race, you will actually have to have a very good, solid political line on it. And I'm not suggesting which way that goes, by the way, but it doesn't feel like the present one is sustainable. So the present line, I think what you're saying is true, would be, well, it's going to be less salient. But that doesn't feel like a sustainable political line in general election.
We've touched on some of this. It's like, okay, so what is the Greens' position on the economy when you get to that manifesto? What's it going to look like? What are the priorities going to be? What is the position on how the food system operates? Which may or may not be in that list of 5-6 biggies. It could well be, actually. I would reckon it might be up there. What are we doing on security, defence, foreign policy, all of that set of things, right? These are questions that in detail you should have an answer by the time you approach an election where you're saying, please vote for us, we want to be in government. That's the sort of detail-specific answer. The Greens don't need to think about that in terms of what they're doing in migration, I would say. And from my point of view, is like we need a robust set of answers about what is it actually going to look like. Because the policy document at the minute is a bunch of good principles and visions of what this could look like that is going to also have to think about how you're going to implement it. Like, what is the Home Office actually going to be doing if you suddenly arrive in charge of it in June 2029? Like, what is it really going to do? And that isn't just going to be, for fairly obvious reasons, it could be actually close the Home Office down and do something else entirely, right? That's actually not a bad idea. But you're going to have to put the work in to get there, and to make that case, and to build the detailed policy programme around that. And I think that's something that's going to happen. I think that look, one of the things that's taking place, you can see it from the outside or inside with the Greens, there's a lot of people who've moved over from Labour who have been tempered or even steeled by that experience, who are really quite serious about what you need to do if you're thinking about being in government. And there's a lot of preparation about going through what is it if, for instance, you end up with Greens running local authorities. What are they actually going to do? With the limited range of powers that those local authorities have, what are you actually going to do? Because the traditional left thing of going, I will simply do no cuts, it doesn't happen.
We won't pass a budget with cuts.
Okay, and then they send the commissioners in, you're all no longer councillors, and they do the worst cuts you can think of because they don't care, because they don't have an electorate to answer to, right? So what do you actually do? And it's good to have those more serious conversations, because at the minute, as I say, the policy document looks like big aspirations for this would be a better world and we can think about this. The steps and how you get there, The steps on what you do in government are a different conversation, and one that has to happen over the next few years.
Yeah, it's John Lennon, Imagine. Okay, well, you can't run a country like that. They're nice ideas and it's a nice vision, but it's just that. It's a vision.
It's good to have a vision. It's good to be visionary.
It is, because and rightly so, because, the Tories and Labour don't have a vision. That's a big part of their political problems at the moment. I want to finish by asking you what priorities the Greens should have in government. But before I ask you that, I have to ask you about your party.
Oh, okay, right.
What do you think, quickly? Because I don't want to dwell on negativity, but, I think not that long ago, it looked like they would be the beneficiaries of this collapse in the two-party system alongside reform, maybe. But the Greens have just taken all that energy since Zack Polanski won his party's leadership. None of this was priced in a year ago. Why do you think your party got so much so wrong so quickly?
I mean, look, I think it's a great shame what's happened to your party, because there's a lot of good people involved in it, and there's a lot of people just spending so long on trying to make this work, and then it didn't, and it's kind of it's sort of tragic to sort of see that effort being applied, and it's just not come through. I've got a big picture version of that, which is back to why do I think the Greens are meeting this moment? It is, and I wrote about this in Morning Star, but I wrote about this, which is that it is in part because they do not arrive with the baggage of Labourism and the Labour Party and the social democratic tradition. They just arrive in this weird, difficult new moment that we're all in and have been, let's date it since the pandemic, of repeated crises, of the global system falling apart. They arrive without the baggage that attaches them to certain parts of that pre-weird period existence, which is what the Labour Party has. And if you don't have to think about what would be the ideal form of a new social democratic party. And a lot of people in your party say, oh, no, we're going to be more radical than that. But they're spending their time trying to respond to what that would be, because we're going to be more radical than this. If you don't think like that, if you don't think what would be the ideal kind of social democratic party, if instead you think we're not a social democratic party, we're doing something different, that is powerful, and it's a clear break. And it's because it's a clear break that it looks more appealing. And it's easier for Zack Polanski to do something like, we will look after the hairdresser and the plumber, than it would be for a Labour leader to do what they all do, which is we will look after the teacher and the nurse. And these are all people who should be looked after. But it's who you're going to say is so different when you're over in the Greens, because that's how you're going to build your new coalition. That's how you're going to develop a form of government. That's a really big picture answer for it. The shorter version is it's just difficult once the Greens were there. I mean, that's the really short version. Once that space has been occupied, and Zack had occupied it well for hey, we're the basically left alternative to Labour. The oxygen's gone, the momentum's gone, the space, the capacity for your party to be that just disappears entirely. And had they got there quicker, maybe it would have been them. Maybe it would have been your party. Had your party been formed 12 months before it was, maybe it would now be your party with those 200,000 actual members. That might have been what happened. But this is the counterfactual that we won't ever have an answer to. The Greens got there first. And they got there first, I would say, because they were just better primed to be able to respond to this moment than your party was, with its particular attachments to Labourism in practice. They were able to move faster, and that's why we got there, and that's why we have this new party in the form of the Greens developing.
So, it's 2029. We're a month out from the Green Party manifesto being formulated. The polls are very good. It's looking like a hung parliament. They could form a government. What do you think the priorities for the Green Party in that moment should be? You
have to make a judgment about what the world will look like in 2029.
Let's say it looks like more or less like
it's going to be like
it is now.
It's going to look like now, but worse. I mean, that's kind of that's my slightly bleak prognosis. I don't think we're going to have a sudden rebound of growth. I don't think the climate crisis is going to unwind itself. I don't think the geopolitical tensions are going to go away. Stack all that up, it's got to be the cost of living. It's going to have to be the cost of living, which is the cost of living is a cost of adaptation. Primarily, that's the deep underlying part of it, is this is a problem of climate change. So how are we responding to climate change in a way that protects people and can be attractively given to people as how you might have a better life out of this? And that's going to include, how are we delivering food? How are we delivering electricity, energy to people's homes at a price they can afford in a way that's going to work? How are we protecting people from increasing floods and extreme weather events? There's a stack of things that start to emerge around the cost of living crisis, which I do not believe is going to be solved. So that's going to end up being top. And that's going to be the Greens and everyone. Every party is going to have a version of their answer to that. The Greens are going to have the best one, I would say, I think, because they're going to be the people who can get closest to the actual problem here, which is how are you going to protect people from climate change, the crisis of nature, and then above that, the geopolitical shocks, and how are you going to do it in a way where you're not going to care too much about the niceties of free markets are always right and finance capital must always be in charge, right?
So on cost of living, is that going to be a demand issue or a supply issue?
It's a supply issue.
Right. So it's not giving financial, I don't like to use the word handouts, but that's what it could be. It's not saying we're going to give everybody £1,000 to deal with the cost of living crisis in 2029. You're saying that we need to have resilience in the
I think we need resilience in the food supply chain, the energy supply chain, the water supply chain, by the way, which is creeping up as a significant issue in this country. And you need a programme that's going to make sure that these things are delivered fairly in a way that protects people's standards of living and does so with an element of social justice baked into it. So that's a complicated set of problems, right? You're a long way outside of relatively easier problems, which are how do we tax people fairly so that we can fund the NHS properly? Yeah, that's sort of more basic kind of questions in politics that we've all got used to in the last few decades, right? I think we're into something much tougher at this point. That's why you need a think tank. You need to think about some of the difficult questions. You've got to face some of the harder issues because this is going to be top of what people care about by 2029.
So one issue, 3 words, cost of living.
Cost of living. Yeah.
James Meadway, very elegant way to end the conversation. It's been a long one, but a very, very fruitful one. Thanks for joining us today on Downstream.
Thanks for having me.